Anyway, cool. So you messaged me being like, let's talk about thinking that rejects other thinking. And I'm in a like do stuff now rather than later kind of mode. So I'm just like, let's talk. And here we
Yeah,
are.
serendipitous.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I posted a comment on your thing, which is like some prior art, but like also I've been thinking about fundamental ignorance, which is like a core Buddhist theme. And then I've also been thinking about like the way there's like mindlessness is taught, which is like definitely rejecting thinking at the object level.
Mindlessness.
Yeah, like a lot of schools, there's a lot of spiritual schools that are like verbal thoughts are bad. You should like
Oh yeah,
suppress
yeah, yeah,
verbal
yeah.
thoughts.
Right, and that's like thinking that rejects all thinking.
Yeah.
That's like that's the OG, not the OG, but it's like.
And then I've been thinking in terms of like, I've been calling it active ignorance. The other dude on Edge was calling it, who's like part of the group that studied this, was calling it deliberate ignorance. Something like the difference between like things that you don't know, like you ignore because you don't know how to pay attention to them, versus things that like they're within your field of potential awareness, but you are actively engaged in some process that suppresses information about them. And it's like you get this in other people when you like have an insight that they're not ready for, and like their objections are like oddly specific, even though it seems like they sort of like don't know, they don't actually have, in theory they don't have the insight, which is why you're trying to like get them to see it. But like their objections are like oddly specific, such that like you suspect they kind of already know but have rejected it.
Oh, interesting. I don't know that I've like experienced that in any way I've been aware of. Yeah.
But yeah, all these different takes are like aspects of like there's a bunch of stuff here, and a bunch of it is slippery and weird. Yeah. Like as you were saying in your post.
Right. Hence the post being like sort of weirdly circuitous and like coining a kind of deliberately obtuse name for the thing.
Right. To like avoid the standard like off ramps that you already have, like the standard immune suppressant that you're already on.
Right.
Oh, the other version is another version is error theory versus
conflict theory.
Conflict theory. And the way like it's actually a way for error theorists often to dissociate from engaging with the concept of a world in which there are actual adversarial players, because that's very scary.
Are you saying that what is such a way to dissociate?
Error theory.
Yeah. I had a really cool like error theory itself is that thing. Yeah. I had a cool conversation with Max Harms a month or two ago where he was talking about some model that he had that was trying to sort of make a Steelman error theory that still incorporated like that, like actually incorporates all of the whole conflict theory thing. And I said, you should write something up about that. And he's like, I will if you send me an email prompt. And I sent him an email prompt and he has written something up and I have not gotten around to reading it yet. So that's the thing that's kind of on my radar. But I think part of the gist is, so like I have a statement that I don't think is quite true, but it's sort of satisfyingly evocative of something that's true. And it's something like, if you have sufficiently advanced information theory, you don't need game theory anymore.
It could be like a physics chemistry thing though.
Right. So that's one interpretation. Max brought up something similar, but then said like, but I also think chemistry is unnatural.
Yeah, I fall in the like chemistry is actually a central example of like
something that technically reduces but like isn't worth reducing.
Yeah, like natural, the concept of natural abstractions being a good concept.
Nice, yeah. Anyway, right, so I think there's truth to that. And it also, you know, if you fix the statement as somehow true, then it implies a quality of information theory that's sort of beyond what's usually considered information theory or something like that. But at any rate, yeah, it's like you simultaneously need moves that don't lose on the game theoretic level, but also like change the game and like in a win-win direction. To quote Leonard Cohen, there is a war between the ones who say there is a war and the ones who say there isn't.
Yeah, so like if you're trying to help a hell realm being out of hell, like they don't have as much strength as you do to like boulder out of hell, right? And so like you need to find a route that is like they can't follow the route that you took out, because the route you took out was like built for your strengths, and they don't have your strengths. If they did, they wouldn't be in hell. So like you have to like go and like learn, like you have to like learn about their weaknesses, and then like find like chart a route out helping them.
Yeah.
Like the inferences have to be like their size, their shape, so that each step has local validity for them.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and this applies to much more like I don't want to call math boring, but like much more quotidian things that people go about learning, such as math, or much more mainstream things that people go about learning, such as math. There was a math program developed by somebody who was like, yeah, I can tutor some math students. He like, had like dropped out of college math or something like that, but he'd studied some college math and he needed some money. And he's like, sure, I'll tutor some math students. And he got assigned like all of the sort of, I don't know what the term for this is these days, but something like special needs kids, right? Basically like the kids that were just completely unable to do anything with the ordinary math classes. And he was like, okay, can they count? It just like started with some really like, he started by trying to make no assumptions. Basically, he was like, what is these guys' relationships to numbers? Can they count? Right? Can they like, if you can count, right, you can pick up a number of objects and you can tell how many there are. You can't do it necessarily instantly, but you can like do the like sequence thing. And he just built up from counting to like, addition to, and, multiplication and fractions and like all of this other stuff. And he just discovered there are steps small enough that everybody can follow them. But typical schools use steps that are just too big for most people's legs, right? Like if you just imagine like a staircase, right? You've got like, you could make a staircase that I could go up, but like a 4-year-old couldn't, right? Like it would not be a staircase to them. It would be a wall followed by a platform followed by a wall. And so basically he just like went and made the steps really fucking tiny. And as a teacher, you're looking at it, you're like, how is this step even different from the previous step? Like it's really, really subtle stuff. It's like, all right, now do the multiplication of these fractions like this. Now do it like that. I spent a few hours tutoring a middle schooler in this thing. So I have a sort of a felt experience of the worksheets, and the steps are really fucking tiny, like he says in his talk. And I'm like, wow. But the inane thing about school is that it goes, oh, well, I guess you just can't climb steps at all. I guess you're just slow. Like, anyway, that's a whole thing.
And it's two-dimensional, right? So there's not just a single set of stairs. It's like multiple.
Oh yeah. At least
like,
to, many sort of whatever is in parallel that like, tech tree basically. Yeah. Right. It's like a tech tree, but they skip steps and then they expect it. Like, imagine you're in a video game. Imagine you're in a video game where there's no map of the tech tree and other people are just building stuff. And you're like, how do I get that? Right. And, and you're like, maybe if I, right. And there's sort of like, there's no button you can just push to like research the next thing. Like you also can't.
There's survival games that are like this. I think there's at least a couple, and people like it.
Like what?
So it's like survival games where there is a tech tree, but there is no documentation of the tech tree.
What's the gameplay like? Like, how do you get tech?
You like it's like Minecraft and stuff. Like you hit things and like try combining different types of materials.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Right.
And then like you just discover emergent properties of
objects. Yeah, nice. That's cool. That's very cool. Yeah,
So do you want to hear something sad?
sure.
So as far as I can tell, I looked into it a little bit, and new math, which everyone likes to denigrate, right? Because it's like seems clearly insane from our perspective.
Mhm.
As far as I can tell, actually kind of started out as something like this. The issue is it started out with live people, like in the sense of live players, who were
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
let's
yeah.
actually try to like have different abstractions and different ways of blah, blah, blah. And then was passed off to dead players. And then
Yeah.
dead players didn't understand at all what the building up of abstractions was.
Yeah.
And then it turned into what you see as the mockery, mock-worthy new math.
Many such cases.
Right?
Oh, anyway, this thing I was just talking about is called dump math, for what it's worth. And seems really good, you know? And yeah, it seems like you're pointing at there being potentially like similar things for awakening, right? Like similar sorts
Everything.
of,
It's all developmental psychology in a certain sense.
right.
But yeah, so like for instance, you could go with Buddhist psychology, in which case you might say something like each realm has certain types of information that it actively ignores. You could also do like a Keegan-esque developmental psychology thing where you're like, at each stage, there is a certain threshold for ignoring information that is incongruous with that stage, right? So things from the next that require the next, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's that buildup of error before a violent dissolution happens.
Right. Yeah. I'm thinking about Mark's like framing of progress as non-monotonic.
Yeah, another cut is something like, this one's a bit harder to hold.
Oh wait, hang on. My mic is probably nicer now. At any rate, you won't hear me typing if I take it typing. Just turn on some noise canceling shit.
Wait, so what was the sentence right before you mentioned the non-monotonic thing?
You said something about a buildup of stuff that then releases.
Buildup of errors.
I mean, you're sort of pointing at the Kuhnian paradigm shift, but on an individual level.
Yeah, there's also a thing in dominance hierarchies of whose suffering will be ignored, right? So like one of the things about a dominance hierarchy is that people higher in the hierarchy are allowed to externalize suffering onto people lower in the hierarchy. So it's again that thing of like active ignorance where it's like people know, but there's an active
you kind of can't talk about it.
Suppression process. Yeah, because it sort of it would put the lie to the current equilibria.
Yeah. I like how you talk about this. When I hear most people talk about it, they are reifying it in some direction. They're making some sort of, it's not exactly normative claim, but like I was on a call recently, and I didn't catch exactly what the context was because I was like out of the room getting a snack, but I sort of heard some sort of snippet where somebody was like, most of human behavior is virtue signaling. And if you can't understand some sense in which that's true, then you're like missing something, obviously. And especially, it's important to understand that like things are virtue signaling that don't necessarily look or feel like virtue signaling at first. But there's also sort of a sense in which like, it's like, no, you're making a few confusions. One of which is something like that you can only ever do anything by virtue signaling. Like the person didn't say that with words, but sort of implied that like that was the only possible way to motivate people or something. And it's like, nah, man, like sometimes just food is delicious and music sounds good. and like a bunch of people jamming who are dropped into the pocket are like not, they're not focused on virtue signaling, even though they're trying to impress each other. Like they're still just like, they're trying to blow each other's minds, not like whatever. And they're like, they're using their own taste function, you know, like not just like social whatever. So that's like one confusion that's being made. But the other confusion is something that drops out of PCT, which I've recently been revisiting. I reread Making Sense of Behavior, and I've been checking out a couple other PCT books. And one really cool thing that drops out of PCT is that most of the time you notice, I forget, it's like something like you notice what you're doing when what you're doing isn't getting you what you want. But otherwise what you're doing is just kind of in the background, sort of. And so it's like, no, the reason virtue signaling is so fucking salient is that it doesn't fucking work. Like, that's why there's so obviously much of it once you know how to tune into that wavelength, is because, yeah, it's a very predominant strategy, but it's also a strategy that doesn't work very well. And therefore it like sort of is visible by its failing to work. Whereas like all the things that are happening that are not virtue signaling, that are just business as usual, everything's working fine, are the vast majority of what in fact people are doing. So it's no, most of what people do is not virtue signaling.
It's very elegant. I like that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, visible via its failure to work is a pretty good encapsulation. Oh, you said another thing that I also lost. I should have written it down.
The first half of the thing about why virtue signaling isn't, or something else.
No, it was something specific, but I think it might be lost. It's okay.
There's a thing about musicians jamming. Oh, coming back a slightly further step, but running through that briefly. The other issue with the virtue signaling thing is that it has this quality of like, you shouldn't virtue signal because it's bad and fake, and also you can't help virtue signaling all the time, is like kind of what this guy was saying, like simultaneously. Like it was sort of a double bind. And anything that you do, I can tag as just virtue signaling, right? Like, and so this then connects back with the thing I was saying about how I really liked how you were speaking about the dominance hierarchy thing. Like you were speaking about it in a way that felt to me extremely, I don't quite like all the connotations of this word, but clean. But I mean clean in the sense of like a basketball shot that just is like nothing but net. Like it wasn't carrying a moral lesson, I guess is maybe the way to put it. You were just like, yeah, so in dominance hierarchies, this thing happens and blah, 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 blah.
And it wasn't, and this is why civilization is collapsing and I don't have a girlfriend.
Fuck. It do be like that. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the thing that you were saying pinged also like the one true theory problem, like the one true compression, the one true something, whatever it is, the one true X, of like, it's like you show people a sky full of black holes and you're like, okay, so like you got to navigate carefully because like obviously like, and they're like, okay, yeah, I can see that there's going to be a lot of optimization criteria for deciding which black hole to throw myself into. And you're like, whoa, wait, what? And they're like, well, yeah, I mean, I have to choose a really good one and then I'll have my black hole and then I don't have to worry about anything ever again because I'm just have been maximally compressed. I know my one thing and that explains everything else. And everything beyond the event horizon of my singularity is no longer my problem.
I don't feel like I totally understand what you're saying, but this seems like a hilarious metaphor for something.
It's like old people have learned a set of strategies, and
Oh,
at some point the strategies stop being adaptive, and so they just slowly wall off the world so that they don't interact with the parts of the world that they don't have strategies for anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And now they have their own personal event horizon that they're inside of.
Mm-hmm. Did you know that the guy who gave the talk on filter bubbles, do you remember that one, the like TED talk back in the day? So he went and started a website that was supposed to bust filter bubbles. The website was Upworthy.
Yeah. History, it would seem, is not without a sense of irony.
Yeah. I remember I was following this site called the Good News Network. And I love it in principle. Like one of my favorite articles on there was like some little kid, like a bus driver, like got out of a bus to do something, and the bus was parked on a hill, and the clutch or the the emergency brake wasn't properly working, so the bus starts rolling down the hill, and some fucking 12-year-old jumps in the driver's seat and like steers the bus into columns so that it doesn't just like plunge into the river or the ocean or something. This is good news. This is like, it's also kind of meaningless, but it's like it's good news, right? But like they would also cover like policy decisions, and it was like, that's more complex, man. Like there are a lot of people very unhappy about this.
Yeah, I had the same experience. I was subscribed to a similar thing, and then they were like, "Good news, we banned nuclear in another blah blah blah," and I was like, "Oh fuck." So I unsubscribed. Yeah.
Yeah. I recently started trying to write up what it's basically like a political platform, and it's not the political platform that it doesn't think it's the political platform that I would have if I spent a ton of time researching all of the things, because I don't know what that is. I obviously couldn't write it. I mean, I could write it, what my best guess at what that would be, obviously, but I can't know that because I haven't done the information digesting. But it's what political platform, if a party were running with that platform, would most excite me. Would be like, they get it. Hey, these guys, like, just from my point of view in particular. Like, not do I think would be viable, do I think would be the best way to actually be most likely to navigate the path of getting all the stuff that I want actually passed by the government, but just like, what would excite me? Like, I would be like, oh my God, they have the correct opinions on all the issues. So I just like started thinking about that. I don't know why, but like, it just seemed like a thing to do. Like, what do I actually think about all this stuff? Like outside of the lens of like the pre-existing categories. Like in Canada, we have slightly more because we've got like more than two parties, but like, so we have like the Green Party is sort of like, they have some economically conservative opinions, but they're also like, obviously really gung-ho on climate, but they're also super woke. And so like the first two things I'm like, great. And then they're like, but we're super woke. And I'm like, anyway.
So yeah, my registered prediction would be actually absent the context of reactions to reactions to reactions. You don't have a opinion about the things, because it is closely entangled with that context of reactions to reactions to reactions.
And by reactions and so on, you mean like the fact where the platform would actually have to get somewhere in order to be a real platform?
No, like the set of things that has caused you to be excited about certain things are not themselves directly in touch with reality, but themselves are reactions to other things.
I think that's quite partially true. I've come across at least some of them via a bunch of different angles. Like I keep arriving back at UBI. Like when I don't set out to invent UBI, I'm like, oh, and then in order to do that, we need UBI. Like it just like kind of wanders its way there.
That's what it feels like to be in a gravitational attractor.
Right. Yep.
Which doesn't mean that it's wrong, right? So you can keep
no, totally. I mean, truth is an attractor. Like it's one attractor.
That sounds like a strong claim. Because it also has anti-attractor properties.
How so?
In the space of attractors, truth can be like anti-gravity technology sometimes.
Oh.
Like it renders you immune by making you like orthogonal along some of the dimensions they try to grab you.
Well, when I hear they try to grab you, I hear a very narrow type of attractor.
I mean, everything has to grab your attention in order to interact with you.
It doesn't have to try to grab my attention, though.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, agency is pretty loose here, right? Because we often treat non-agentic processes as if they were agentic, because things that are optimized by iterated adversarial games can display agent-like behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like we need a few different terms. It's like, so there's complete randomness. Like the star, well, fuck, it's more complicated than that. The stars look beautiful because we evolved to think they're beautiful. but that's fuck. But leaving that aside, like there's a sense in which like they didn't make themselves for any like messy. But anyway, so I was trying to name something that has like zero of the agentiness thing, right? Maybe like a rock. Like a rock might happen to be beautiful because it like happens to have some symmetry and some whatever, but it's sort of like unless it's at a store, like no selection process caused that. What?
The rock is at a store, and it's like, yeah, of course. It's just like it's like I imagine like you wandering past like a De Beers like store, and people are like, oh, and you're like, oh, what you got in there? Rocks? Oh, nice. Really good luck with that.
Those are some pretty good ones.
It's taking you a while.
Anyway, yeah. And so then you get things like something like, you know, a flower like has symmetry and smells nice for the purpose of attracting animals, happens usually not you in particular that they evolved for, but turns out there's some inherent beauty to symmetry and symmetry to beauty and blah 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 blah, and so there you go. But the flower is still for the most part not a control system, which is like a different kind of active agent. Oh, that's a really neat model. Something like the flower is a dead player and a control system is a live player. Sort of maps. Which then kind of points at how like people who are dead players are not sort of bringing any relevant control systems to bear on the situation. It's not like they're not using control systems to brush their teeth and shit, but like
they're operating within bounds that are pretty easy to like themselves compress or something. Like other people are setting up their control loops and they're just running within them and not.
Yeah, they're just running with them, and they're also it makes their behavior. The thing they're controlling for is something like, you know, if you check out the moral mazes type stuff, or like viewed through that lens, which I haven't actually read. I've just seen a couple of these summaries, but viewed through the moral mazes lens or whatever, it's like the thing they are controlling is not getting fired. And actually, like they're kind of doing whatever doesn't get them fired, but they aren't actually controlling any other strategically relevant variables directly. That actually seems like approximately the right model. Huh.
It goes back to the denizens that they have their inference loops of their size and shape.
Say more.
Like that bureaucrat has a particular view of the world, right? And if you try to explain things from too far outside of that context, it won't make sense, right? Because they're used to a certain distance or shape for a loop to take before it results in a reward. And if the thing that you're talking about doesn't sound like it results in a reward within that window,
Oh,
then
interesting.
it won't be real. It'll be like you're talking about some abstract thing. I don't see how this connects to any reward.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've been starting to, well, I've been for a couple of years collecting a whole bunch of thoughts on how to improve Twitter as an application, as a platform, as a system. And recently, Tashin sort of challenged me to actually write up a blog post about this and like publish it. That's like actually addressed to Twitter, as opposed to just being like Malcolm rambles about stuff like that's of interest to him, right? So like actually trying to take Twitter's perspective and like what would they want to read. And several of the responses to this in different ways have been like, well, you got to make this pitch in terms of what'll make their ad revenue increase. And there's a level in which that's true, like straightforwardly true. But the way that people think about it feels like itself like narrow in scope, and also missing the part where like Jack goes to Vipassana retreats and like does actually want the thing to be good, even if his ability to control that is actually very like limited and messy.
Well, because reality is surprisingly high dimensional, even if you're operating within a control loop, you can often do things that have side effects that go beyond that control loop, because control loops are not complicated. The control loops that have been built by human hands are not complicated enough to actually fully contain that high dimensionality.
Are you talking about like the world Jack's operating in?
Everything. It's like, yes, you have to write something that creates ad revenue for someone else.
Oh,
and
right.
You can sneakily do other things at the same time.
Right. It's like the writing can evoke a whole vision and like texture of things, even while it's also like, yeah, and this will boost engagement like in these ways. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. And I feel like Twitter is actually exactly the right company to be writing such an open letter to, because literally like at mentions, hashtag, retweets, like all of these features were invented by users. And they were just like, hey, these people are doing a thing, it works. This is cool. We should make this like a thing. Then they like make it a thing, right? So it's like, this is just sort of me being like, hey, here's what's currently on our edge. Like there's a couple things we can't do because like we can't really do well because the built-in features like don't allow it. But we're like trying to do it. We're feeling into it. We're like, and so it's like Twitter is exactly a company that has a proven track record of listening. I mean, usually not like listening to open letters per se, but like listening to what in fact the users are doing. So it's like, insofar as I can point at that very well, like it seems that like the nature of Twitter is to notice, which I just wouldn't assume about any other company of its size.
Well, that segues into why it is being big, which as soon as I phrase it this way, it becomes more obvious why.
Give you more inertia?
No. Why does being big mean that you have so much active ignorance? It's like, well, you're big, so you're going to be ignoring more, like by definition, almost.
Well, how does that follow? It's more relative active ignorance too, right? Like it's not just. I wonder if this relates to scaling laws.
So goals don't scale up in complexity, right? So even if you're really big, your goals still have to be simple.
Oh, that's a really interesting point, right? It's like, yeah, it's like if a company lives or dies based on whether its revenue exceeds its expenses. That's still just one number.
And the things it does to optimize that one number are like, it tries to stick to its comparative advantage. Like it found something that worked. Usually a really mega big company is going to be like, we found 2 to 3 things that really worked. And that's like a real grand slam. Everything else, they just do plug and play, right? They just do the same as everyone else does. There's already existing companies that will help them do that. And then they just focus on doing their comparative advantage well. And they have to do that because you can't coordinate huge numbers of humans around anything other than very simple goals.
Mm. So I've been reading this book called Scale by Jeffrey West from out of Santa Fe Institute. It's really fucking cool. It talks about like the way that space filling algorithms create power laws with exponentials that are all multiples of 1/4 because we live in a 3-dimensional world and all of our capillaries and lungs and stuff have a fractal dimension of 4. Like necessarily in order to be space filling, in order to be maximally efficient in terms of the surface area to volume ratio of the like fractal structure. And so yeah, so this book is sort of talking about a bunch of that stuff in a really deep way. And it talks about the difference between a company and a city. And I haven't gotten to all of this yet, but like companies and cities are both, large collections of humans. They both sort of have inflows and outflows as systems. And yet companies die in an exponential rate, which is to say, no matter how old a company is, it has like a 1% chance of dying per year or something like that. Or I forget what the percent is, but the point is it's constant. And whereas cities almost never die. He's like, what's going on there? Or like, what types of different creatures are these? And cities are actually really weird. Like there's no immortal organism, right? And there's no immortal company, but there are these weirdly immortal cities. And so I haven't gotten to all of this, but he points at the reason companies die is that in order to be competitive, they need to focus on their advantage, and they need to drive their costs down. And also, and so margins become slimmer. And once your margins are slimmer, a perturbation, whether in the market or in the in the industry or in the supply chain or in your brand image or in your company politics or whatever, a perturbation is enough to kill you.
Homeostatic shock, yeah.
Yeah. And so I was like, oh, so Accomplice is like not going to die in its current state, was like my realization. It could make sense to end it for various reasons. But it could plausibly sort of get out competed if somebody released a thing that was a really amazing clone and was free, right? I think it would still do okay if that occurred, because there's enough loyalty. The other thing getting popular might bring more attention to Accomplice, and a few other factors, right? But it's not going to die because it doesn't have the same overhead problem. Like it doesn't have the same sort of shock, like low margin type thing. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting.
Well, one of the ways it could, if you had long enough timescales, it probably doesn't on the relevant timescales for you.
Yeah.
If you had long enough timescales, what would actually happen is your wealth would grow enough that eventually the contribution of that to your overall growth of your wealth would become small enough that it would no longer be worth your hassle, and you would actually end it.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think there's one or two other ways too. I mean, like even at present, it's like Accomplice is using an old version of Node because when I try to update to the new version of Node, I get memory errors. And I'm like, I have not found time or relevant expertise to help me solve this problem yet. Like, I talked to a couple friends and I emailed the Heroku guys and I got some advice, right? But like, I haven't solved this yet, right? And there's various other technologies that Accomplice uses that are gradually getting, end of life. And it's like, okay, what's the plan here? Like web standards are evolving rapidly, and so far Accomplice is not needed to do maybe any like major overhauls because of it, but that could happen, right? And yeah, I want to come back to the thinking that rejects other thinking piece. Not because I have anything in particular on my mind there, but just like I feel like there's probably more you had to say about it or
It's
something.
easy to talk about all the things around it, right? Because like I do feel like it hits on some core things. Keegan's immunity to change, I think, points at it too. So like, what is the mechanism by which we render ourselves immune to change? Well, we choose to ignore certain facts about our experience.
Right. Yeah. The puzzle of the post, by the way, was that I found myself relating to a post ideology framework that I had in an ideological way. And I was like, this is pathological. Like this is utterly insane in a very literal sense. But how do I point at it without making the same, without causing other people to just literally make it, like it was almost like it's not exactly like a mimetic hazard, because like, you know, up leveling from rejecting some specific thing to rejecting dualism is like, it's still an upgrade. But I was like, I want to do better than that. Like I want to not just recapitulate, you know, the 100th articulation of here's why game B is better than game A.
I'll give another weird metaphor.
Yeah.
So imagine that you have like a computing system that has all these like horrible constraints. It's like some sort of like crazy, it's got a very tiny network bandwidth and it's very memory constrained and you have hardly any operations to work with. There's all sorts of weird hardware constraints that you like figure out as you go. And you're like, okay, I figured out that a lot of this crazy weird information that I get back from like my network bandwidth is like actually structured bandwidth, like websites and stuff. I don't actually have enough local resources to like render it like super efficiently. So it's pretty annoying to like work with. But like, if I could send a message that corresponds to the right like financial data or something, someone will mail me more RAM. And you're like, okay, I'm going to try to do that. Oh shit, my register is so small that I can't actually send messages at the length that the network is expecting them to be sent at.
Huh. I feel like my right hemisphere, like based on everything else you said in this conversation, like half gets what you're kind of getting at here. It's like
I'm doing an information theory version of like, how do you generate the thorn that removes the thorn?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, and part of what's great. So I had a tweet a while ago that was something like, I think we would benefit from ceasing to use like one word nouns to describe like politically charged topics. Like, you know, no racist as a noun. Like people who believe that college admissions should be decided on the basis of race.
Yeah, verb heavy languages are, I believe one thing that they're better at is, okay, this is a complicated topic. I believe one of the things that they're better at is not making as many abstraction level errors as languages that you are more noun heavy. So there's been some, as far as I know, recent research in very poor countries that has called into doubt some of the earlier research about like people are like just malnutrition and they're not taught abstractions from a young age and like there's all sorts of crazy shit going on, and so like these people are like going to have a really hard time learning stuff. And it's like, okay, they went back and looked at the way that those earlier data were gathered, the studies were done, anthropological data was gathered, methodology, and they're like, you were like presenting like some sort of weird abstract alien artifact to people, and being like, they didn't score as high a thing on like our weird alien test that they've never seen anything like. And like most of the time when you gave them this, they were more like, why are you giving this to us? Do we get a reward? What's in this for you? This is very strange. And like a lot of their cognition was actually taken up by like normal sorts of reactions to like, what the fuck?
That sounds right. I mean, if you think about like IQ tests as like, and other tests as like measuring the desire to pass tests,
right?
It's sort of like they were in a situation where they're like, first of all, they may have some desire to pass tests under certain circumstances. You know, if somebody's like, can you jump far enough or whatever, like in the training of the whatever. But first of all, they're like not bought into passing the test. Second of all, they may not have the same concept of what a test, of what that particular test, of what passing it would look like.
Yeah, so like one of the things that came out of this was like, okay, so how are they conceptualizing the situation? And it's like, well, someone who you don't know comes to you and attempts to get you to spend a lot of resources doing something very strange that you don't understand. This sounds like a form of maneuver warfare. And it turns out that mimetic environment, they have a lot of immunity to various forms of maneuver warfare.
So they score really badly on these tests because they're not spending resources on them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, so this was a pro of, actually, I might have lost the stack. We were starting.
You had said verb-heavy languages are better at not making as many abstraction level errors.
Yeah. Okay, so that's an example, right? So the researchers, the first set of researchers, they had a bunch of tacit assumptions about the situation of like, well, yes, adults give you a test and you do your best to pass them, or like whatever it is, right? Like a whole stack if we actually were to investigate it, right? And it's like, in verb-heavy languages, they're not as good at transfer learning as noun-heavy languages, where you can like everything is super modular all the time. But you do preserve the context of things with verb-heavy languages because things are seen as processes. And when the things are processes, you keep track of where they came from and where they're going to.
Nice.
Yeah. So like, and this is like particularly relevant for like hunter-gatherer cognition, actually, because like the entire thing like revolves around like making your process like have impedance matching to the environmental processes such that like you're able to do like your own homeostatic buffering without like dying, right? So all of this, so yeah, I had a different point also, but like also all of this is an example of the thing of like, oh, there's a certain form of cognition that has been engaged in a lot, and it has a bunch of functional fixedness because it's adaptive within a certain milieu.
It's bad. We shouldn't do it.
But yeah, but actually like there's several different types, and depending on the type of environment you're in, like that totally changes the game of like what you should be paying attention to, and what like you would need, how you would need to shape your particular active ignorance to best navigate that environment, because you always have to throw some stuff out because you're very resource constrained. You are resource constrained information.
Yeah, there is still a quality of like throwing stuff out wholesale versus like compressing it. It's like, you know, if you hand somebody a JPEG and then you're like, all right, this, but like only a kilobyte, right? It's like, well, we got a few options. We could make it black and white. That would save us some stuff. We could like, you know, we could dither, we could, you know, like there's a bunch of, you know, or you could just take a tiny piece of the image. And if the thing you're trying to capture is like, what's the texture of a tiger's fur, then that would actually be the best option, the highest res version, but like a really small image.
Right. So choice of loss function.
Yeah.
And so what the noun heavy thing is doing when people like argue with each other with nouns and then like they talk past each other is,
this is X, no, it's Y.
Yeah, they have different loss functions. And so they've optimized for different levels of importance for different things and different understandings of what those things might mean in terms of like processes.
Yeah. Have you seen John Nurst's The Signal and the Corrective? It's this great article where he's like, a bunch of arguments are like fake arguments between people who have the same opinion, except one of them is A but B and the other is B but A. And so like they like never stop to let each other finish their like A but B point, because they're like, the person's like A and it's like, no, but B. Or like there's like it's the same image but like figure ground inversion. So it sounds really different. That's slightly different. It's like it's different than just like, you know, actual like lossy compression that like anyway.
I want to somehow bring the recursion into this, of like, because it's you're not paying attention to something, and you've learned to not pay attention to the fact that you're not paying attention to it, because there is meta level knowledge that if you were to pay attention to it, it would not be able to sustain itself under that attention.
And it needs to sustain itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I it's funny. So last summer I got on a really strong kick of like really welcoming all of my parts and stuff like that, and like really not like tagging any parts as I don't know, bad or whatever, all that kind of stuff. It's related to this whole thing, right? And then I was out walking with Sarah. We were on a hike, and I said something about a self-undermining part, and she was like, that feels kind of like judgmental or whatever. I'm like, no, the part needs to undermine the self, because the self is trying to fuck with it. Like it's not self-undermining doesn't mean bad. It means undermining self. It's like, oh yeah, true. Like, but it was like I had to actually stop and ask, like, why did I say that? And I was like, right, because if the part doesn't trust the self to, like, you know, and by self here, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. By self here, I mean something.
Compression index pointer.
I'm so amused by, like, usually it's like, and by self here, I mean, and like usually like say something. No, by self here, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about.
Well, it's like the for reasons. Like
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
Which I guess if it was used a lot in real life, the babblers would learn to ape, and then you wouldn't be able to say for reasons anymore.
I mean, yeah, right, yeah. I feel like the aping has to actually happens more on the like the listening level than on the speaking level, in terms of how that would get weird.
Huh. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, I see.
Because it's like the reason for reasons works is that you don't need the reasons. And so if people let people use it when they did need the reasons,
yeah,
like that's what would actually let it evolve that way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, everyone could use it; it would be fine. Maybe, I don't know.
I'm not sure. Anyway, I feel like there's an edge case in there, but anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things that's been interesting about my writing over the last year or so is that a bunch of it is one way or another like critiquing the viewpoint that I like used to hold when I was part of the group in Waterloo before I moved out to BC. And they read my blog, but I would write very differently if I were writing just for them. Right? Like if I were like, here, I want to explain like why you're confused about stuff and like, you know, confusions that I had myself 2 years ago. I would write very differently, but I think in some ways my writing is actually probably more persuasive because I'm not writing it as a critique. It forces me to articulate it on its own terms and like form the right generalizations rather than just being like, you guys are confused, blah, 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 like,
Yeah, I would say there's a like illusion of transparency thing of like there's a certain qualia associated with like high clarity writing that is not false, but it does tend to generate writing that feels a little bit dead. Whereas if we are engaging with stuff that's live for us, it'll often come out messier, but will actually the liveness will come through, and people will like be able to totally swing with the messiness.
Yeah, and so then part of what I'm doing with my writing, like the thinking that rejects other thinking post, was actually written in the context of looking at the possibility of doing culture consulting for a company, and realizing like, wait, if I try to bring in a cultural framework that's about how like you shouldn't judge cultural frameworks, fuck, that would make a paradox, wouldn't it? Like, because people by default would be like, they would either be like, this is bad, I don't want to do it, or they'd be like, this is good, we should do this and not the bad thing that we've been doing like previously. Guys, why are you still doing the bad thing? We decided we were going to do the good thing now. With the good thing where you don't call things good and bad. That's what we're doing now. And the words get slipperier, but it's the same basic mental process. And so I was like, can I somehow articulate like the sort of meta level framework in a way that like will be minimally amenable to that particular confusion? And I have probably half a dozen other ways I'm going to point at the exact same thing over the next year, just like a bunch of other angles that I want to hit this from. The next one that's going live is about how like mindset choice is a confusion. It's like the actual correct mindset is just better. And if you feel like you have to choose between it and like the bad mindset, then it's because the thing you're calling the good mindset is like not the thing. You've stuck that label onto something that is not obviously better, and then you've set up a false choice between this thing you're calling the thing and this thing you're calling not the thing.
Well, so this would go doubly true if there are things that basically can't be cached. And it's like, well, what would have the property of being unable to be cached? Well, a thing that is in constant dynamic feedback with the actual environment, like moment-to-moment environment.
Right. Well, part of what's funny too is like I went to write this thing, and I tried to write a preface, and then the preface ends up actually explaining the whole thing, because the preface goes, so I decided to frame the thing. I'm not certain I'm going to publish it this way, but currently the way I have it written is actually in terms of Dave Chapman's term, the complete stance. Because like the other terms that we've been using in the community in Waterloo, like sort of aren't published anywhere. And like, I don't know any super good handles for pointing at the thing that are like, just like out there and in common parlance. So I'm like, well, I'm sort of in the meaningness sphere. I'll just use Dave's term. And I sent him the post and he's like, this makes sense, which was incredibly amazing feedback. Like I actually didn't take it in at first. And then I went and reread his email for some other purpose. And I was like, wow, that's really, like, I just wrote a post that was even using different words, mapped them onto the words that this other author who I admire was using. And his response was just, that makes sense. Like, I was like, I don't know.
This sounds very similar to the experience of reading like spiritual stuff, or like listening to like discourses or whatever, like talks, and then being like thinking that you understood it, and then like kind of knowing that you didn't quite understand some of it, or like some of it seemed like poetic or metaphors, and then going and having an experience, and then going back and like going over the same material and being like, oh, the sense that my previous self had of understanding it was very false.
This is kind of the reverse on the meta level of this exchange with Dave Chapman.
Yes.
Yeah, this is kind of the reverse, because it was like,
Yes.
oh, it's actually the thing, like,
right,
or something. Anyway, so in the preface, I'm like, here I refer to the complete stance as having certain self-evident properties. If those properties aren't obvious to you, then I must be pointing at something else than what you think I'm pointing at, either something completely different or something approximately the same but with some different properties. The thing I'm pointing at is precisely the thing that has those properties. So insofar as you have a referent that seems to work, try it on. But if it doesn't fit, aim towards one that does. And I'm like, fuck, that's the whole post. Right? Like, that is the post.
yeah, send a tweet.
yeah, exactly. I'm like, well, I can just delete the rest of the post that's not the preface then.
Yeah, so like you can, when your compression libraries start getting really good, you start running into the same problems that like the Taoist writers ran into, right? And you're like, oh, I see why they were having problems. But I can't explain to other people in a simple way why.
You should tweet that if you haven't already.
Yeah. Like Google bringing Thich Nhat Hanh, right, to the Google campus. And they're like, tell us, Thich Nhat Hanh, tell us the secret. Finally, we'll see. Well, you're the master. And he's like, look, there's a flower. Look at the fucking flower.
Does he actually say that?
No, he doesn't say look at the fucking flower, but
that would be amazing.
He does gesture a lot at the flower and like talk about some pretty basic stuff. And people
he did bring in a flower and point at it.
It was like already happened to be there because they like had a couple decorations.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And he was like, why are you making this so hard? Because they want the secret, right? They don't want it to be the fucking flower. The flower is unsatisfactory. And he's like, yes. Look at it.
Oh my God. Look at the flower, look at the water, get in the car.
Like, look at the flower and no. No and. Just look at the flower. It's actually quite difficult.
Yeah, right. I totally understand. I know exactly what you're talking about. I have a detailed model that explains exactly what you're saying about this flower and how you're supposed to look at it and not do anything else. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Definitely, for sure. Yep. Oh. I've been loving that you're on Twitter, by the way. It's been great. Thanks. I used to like cross-post your stuff there periodically. I was like, oh, this needs to be on Twitter.
Yeah, it feels less real world constrained than Facebook does.
Yeah. It's a pretty fucking fascinating collective intelligence, like extremely messy, but like Twitter is definitely computing something, and it's computing something way more like interesting and deep than Facebook is on some.
It's closer to a market.
Yeah.
Markets approach a frontier and then they stop being predictable and they start being weird and interesting.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I wonder what makes it have the property of being more like a market. It's something like there's some sort of clearing mechanism. I think it maybe is the same clearing mechanism as Facebook of like retweets or whatever, like resharing, but it's just fast enough to be past some critical threshold.
I think there's two other pieces. Facebook doesn't have quote tweets, which means that like there's no continuity between things or something. Like there's no. Anyway,
every thread is atomic. Yeah.
Like, right. Well, I mean, you can have like a post that comments on another post, sort of, but it's kind of cumbersome, like on Facebook. But with tweets also, like each tweet is small enough that there's like Twitter is a market for remixable ideas. Facebook's just a market for ideas.
Yeah, more branching also. So there's more mutations are explored per thread.
Yeah.
Yeah, mutation rate would also be a critical threshold thing. Like if it's below a certain rate, probably something happens, and then yeah, like memes don't actually proliferate without image boards, not initially. It needed that environment where like people would just grab an image, quickly Photoshop it, and then repost it like immediately in the same thread.
Mm-hmm.
Which wouldn't have started off on like normie Facebook land, like normie internet, right? It had to start off in like a weird corner of the internet where people would do that.
Right.
And then eventually, like because it was already a thing, people would make tools that normies could use to build memes. But that wouldn't have happened unless.
Right. Yeah. Good old Gall's law. I think the other thing about Twitter is that the network structure is different than Facebook. Like most people on Facebook, I think still mostly just are interacting with the people that they've met in person.
Right. Yeah. So there's different connections.
Like it's way less self-organizing. Like Twitter itself self-organizes who's following who, whereas like Facebook is a lot more just like you're just interacting with like whichever subset of the friends gets Facebook the most ad money.
Oh, right. And there's not different types of profiles on Facebook. Everyone's profile is just their Facebook profile.
Well, it's actually the opposite. There are different types of profiles on Facebook. There are people and companies.
Right. And on on Twitter, like you could have your main profile and an alternate profile actually employ completely different strategies on them and engage with them when you want to use those strategies. And that's like a thing. In Facebook, that's not a thing.
Yeah. Not at all.
And to bring it back, those different profiles you have are ignoring different things.
Yeah. Yeah. Rejecting and ignoring are different, though. At least in the way I was using rejects in the title of that post.
Yeah, so I would say rejection. My connotation for rejection is something fully enters conscious awareness and is then pushed out. Whereas ignoring can carry the connotation of something sort of shimmies up to conscious awareness, but never quite.
And the bouncer is like out.
Yeah. It's almost like the spotlight, like a stage in a spotlight. So like you have this like venue and you have whatever's happening on the stage was like lit up by like stage lights. And so it's quite bright and everyone in the venue can see what's happening on the stage because it's like an amphitheater. Mm-hmm. But you also have that everyone's like milling about and occasionally someone yells something that then it enters the realm of the common knowledge of the stage.
You mean people are milling about like in the audience? Not
you don't know who's in the audience because it's dark.
Yeah.
And people are coming and going.
Yeah.
Actually, I like this a lot better than any kind of binary conscious unconscious.
Yeah, I mean, I have a whole rant that I'll publish at some point about how unconscious is essentially like the left hemisphere's word Gentile. Like Gentile is a really unnatural category.
Right.
It means not a Jew.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But there are like many kinds of not a Jew that don't have anything in common aside from not being this thing. Right? It's like unconscious is like Gentile, right? It's like that which is not conscious. That's most of things. They're very different. The idea that they are a category.
I've drawn a boundary and declared that the whole universe is the outside, like the outside versus inside of the boundary. Yeah.
Right.
I guess it's the famous joke, right? The
mathematician with the fence. Yeah.
He's gonna get paid by how much like area he encloses.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's actually, it might map onto also the concept of illegal.
Well, especially in the everything that's not forbidden is mandatory sort of phase of things, where like law of the excluded middle is actually taken seriously.
I mean, even before that though, there's like the idea that illegal forms a natural category. I mean, the idea that legal forms a natural category is also weird.
Yeah, this is the sign of a tortured ontology, right?
Right. Yeah. There was a great article I read when Canada legalized cannabis a few years ago, where some cops were like going into schools to like explain to children why marijuana wasn't bad anymore. Like how do you explain that?
I assume that all of the cops had strong grounding in history and legal theory.
Yeah, for sure. And like ontology too, probably. Yeah. I mean, this is like, Eliezer pointed out at one point, like something like, people are like, but the Basque people can't secede from France. That would be illegal.
Right, type errors. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, yes. But no.
Yeah, so I feel like this isn't quite the right thing to say, but there's something in the direction of like ignoring type errors is one of the ways that the mind is getting a bunch of stuff done. And so it ignores that it's ignoring type errors. It's like when the programmer who he goes to show you compilation of something, and you're like, wait, but it's showing like 12 flags. And he's like, oh yeah, but those are the flags you don't have to worry about. And like,
right.
so, like he knows which flags he doesn't have to worry about, which is like a particular thing. Yeah, so the internal economy of the mind, there's a bunch of this, of like local exchanges between subnetworks. Like they know locally like which sorts of kind of shady exchanges are like basically fine. And then they run into problems when they try to scale.
Fascinating, yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is like, I consider one of my top tweets to be one that was like rationality. What's it? Rationality is only possible within a frame or something like that. And like the exoteric meaning is like, you can't have rationality without a frame, but like the esoteric meaning is within a frame. You can't have anything other than rationality. Like everything that you're doing is rational within the frame in which you're in fact doing it. You just usually don't know what the frame is. So you do a bunch of things and they seem irrational. That's because you're judging them from some other frame.
There's also like an emptiness interpretation, right? Like if you didn't have a frame, things would be actually just purely rational. Or you're already saying that?
Oh wait, if you didn't have a frame, things would be purely
rational.
Well, I mean, if you had,
to an extent that it would become meaningless. It would literally just be like processes interacting and nothing else. Like no reason or like no reason to pay attention to any part of it or carve any part of it up or do anything with the outputs or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I was pointing at that directly, but there's a thing adjacent to that. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, well, it's like, okay, so suppose you've got a mind that's made up of a bunch of frames, or as you put it a few years ago, a flock of thermostats, right? Like, locally, everything that's happening makes sense. But then when it tries to interrelate, it like maybe makes some amount of sense, like semi-locally, like regionally, you know, but it sort of doesn't, as you say, scale. And, you know, and then this just happens one fractal layer up between people, right? Which is where you get into the sense in which, you know, mistake theory is true. Mistake theory won't stop someone from mugging you. Mistake theory also won't stop somebody from, you know, if they happen to somehow manage to be motivated enough, like, you know, scheming on how to ruin your life, you know, despite your best attempts to not have your life ruined. This is rare, but it does happen. I forget where I was going with that. Maybe I wasn't going anywhere with that.
I feel like besides just ignorance, there's like an entangled thing. So like the ignorance is in shadow in a certain sense, or like cast shadows, or however you want to conceptualize it. Mm-hmm. And then that winds up entangled with blame or like responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Like who was supposed to be monitoring that? And it's like, well, that might be itself be entangled with like who is allowed to be blamed for this sort of problem. Like, for instance, are individuals a reasonable abstraction layer on which to blame obesity?
Right. I've been exploring something about how utterly confused blame is in the first place. Like basically that there is no reasonable abstraction layer on which to blame things.
I just like I have like a process that's like doing the thing of like pointing at the fire just off frame, and the fire is like all of legal theory. Which is a fire, right? It is like a dumpster fire in a certain sense. But it's like also like,
like dude, right. So there's still a whole big thing that's got to be sorted out there.
Right, because like causal reality does in fact throw consequences at you, and like if you don't want to get paralyzed by them, you have to like apportion the costs of that and then move on because there's more stuff coming at you.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And like not deciding on a system is still a decision because then it just gets apportioned just however conditions.
Yeah, totally. That's a really great response to what would be like a naive implementation of like a post-blame approach to things or whatever. I'm just jotting that down. I'm actually just jotting down that you had a good critique of it, or like a good like but in my Rome, so it's like if I go and like I'm working on that blog post, I'll be like, Romeo said some stuff about this in this conversation we had on this day. Anyway, but anyway, the thing I was feeling into though was basically like thinking that it's a good abstraction to blame an individual for something is in some sense like as confused as thinking it's a good abstraction to blame like the Queen of England, your dog, and the weather all at once. It's like that entity doesn't actually exist as a real entity. Like that's not a that is not a natural system boundary. Now, any one of those three entities is like a way more natural system boundary than the three of them all put together. And sure, an individual is a more natural entity than, you know, two random individuals on opposite sides of the world who've never interacted in any direct way, right? Like, you know, sure, an individual is like a more reasonable thing, but it's still remarkably like incoherent as a, or like remarkably lacking in clear system boundary, something like that. I don't have a very good articulation of this yet, but I feel like I perceived it in a way that was like self-evident.
Actually, yeah, that jogs what for me is a novel definition
Of blame?
not a complete one. No, of individual, which is
nice.
a system that has privileged access to information about the intent of that system. Which is like plays into why you might hold them responsible at the level of abstraction of individual, right? It's like, well, it's natural to treat this as like an intentional blob. And that has good consequences regardless of the fact that there's leaks in the abstraction.
Right. That's neat. And it gets at a couple of points, like one of which is that, you know, my access to my, so like, you know, the PCT folks talk about how you can in some sense know what you're controlling, like directly, you can sort of introspect on it. It feels like something to want things to be a particular way. You know, you can intend to have an intention in a few seconds, at which point everybody else will be able to see your intention too, because they'll watch you do it. But like, until you've done it, nobody else can tell like whether you're intending to pick the blue thing or the red thing or whatever. So, or you can sort of know why causally, you can introspect why you chose the red thing or the blue thing. But then there's also like, you know, the split brain things where people will generate a reason why they picked the thing that was not the reason they picked the thing. And then there's also like on a totally different level of, for a totally different meaning of unconscious, there's also like all of the control systems that are running that we're not aware of. But you're making a point that like in principle, the sort of the individual still has access, a kind of access to those unaware things that, you know, their friend doesn't.
Right. And so one of the proper purviews of legal scholarship or legal philosophy in an ideal world would actually be investigating how and to what extent that is true or not true. Like the privileged access that the system does actually have to its own intent. So this would actually create a society that has developmental tiers baked into the ontology of the legal system, because having more access to your intentions would in fact enable you to take responsibility for more, like have privileges that other people might not, because you are in fact taking responsibility for those things.
Yeah, that would be a total shit show if anyone tried to implement it now.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
I mean, they simply wouldn't, even in a sense. Like it's like someone could implement a thing that looks like privileged tiers, but it would have so little resemblance to the thing you're pointing at as to be not even a confused version of it.
It would probably, like in real life, it would probably look something more like PhD things, like the way that you only get made a PhD by a panel of other PhDs agreeing that you're a PhD. And there would be some sort of like recursive
in the olden days, adulthood was like that.
Yeah.
Then it got too big and we had to just pick a number. I have a sudden flashback to a poster in San Francisco that I saw that was like the legal drinking age is 21. Thanks for not providing alcohol to teens. And I was like, as a 20-year-old Canadian who's been legally drinking in my own country for a year, fuck you. like just sort of the sort of ontological primacy of the thing. Sure, like I respect the laws, but the just the whole frame that it's doing is just like, wow.
So the remaining ontological barriers we do have get overloaded because they're so sparse. If we had more, we could like load them up more evenly. But the remaining ones become very like fought over and fraught because they're like, so the same reason
right. Adulthood is one of the few things,
yes.
anything resembling the thing you're talking about that we have. I was just reading earlier today about a person who was born on February 29th in the year 2000 and committed a crime on February 28th, 2018. And there was a whole case over whether she could be tried as an adult or not. Like, is February 28th her birthday of that year, or does she not become 18 until March 1st?
Yeah. So this recapitulates internal processes, right? Like you build up all of these like edge cases, and eventually
literally
you start noticing.
Literally the Twitter thread I was following was called like worst bad edge cases. Like is the handle world's most aggravating edge cases.
So I think one of the things is calling it privileges is not quite right, because in a privilege system, it's automatically seen that being higher privilege is better. It's kind of a unidimensional like hierarchy.
Right, but this would actually be simultaneously you're held to a greater level of responsibility because you can be.
Yeah, and so people actually would choose to not have, responsibility level platinum. Sometimes they'd be like, I just don't want to do that. Maybe in the future I will, but I'm not going to do it yet. Like deciding not to have a child yet, right? It's just like, nope, I'm not going to do that. Maybe in a few years. Right.
Nice.
And that would actually be a good sign that the system was working if people were making like deliberative choices like that.
Yeah. That seems right. Oh, it's fun imagining a sane society.
So people lower in the hierarchy, they have the privilege of ignoring things that people higher in the hierarchy cannot, when taking into account the consequences of their actions.
It's interesting your use of cannot there. I almost corrected it to may not, but it's actually sort of both. Yeah.
I'm also realizing that I don't have to posit this as some hypothetical system. It already exists.
What do you mean?
Psychological development levels are kind of already this.
Right. They just don't have any connection to the legal system approximately.
Yeah. But I mean, like in terms of the consequences you care about, in terms of like your own integrity, like it's fully linked up. So yeah.
Right. In terms of In terms of the development, like particularly if you focus on like Kohlberg or somebody who's framing the whole thing in terms of ethics in the first place, it's like there is a sense in which like, somebody who's Keegan 5 should be tried by a bunch of other Keegan 5s.
Which, I mean, immediately lends the hilarious thought of the Keegan 2s being judged by other Keegan 2s. I feel like we got to televise this because this shit's going to be crazy. And he was super selfish, and he wasn't even maximally selfish. And he failed to uphold the. And the other person's like, "Wait a minute, what are you getting out of saying that?" Like.
Oh my fucking god, this reminds me of like I was talking to I was in a group conversation with Elliot Riedelman sometime in the last few weeks where he brought up something like
I'm sorry, just before.
Yeah.
The camera has that, you see that argument?
Yeah.
And then the camera pans and the judge is not paying attention because they're just counting the bribe money. That's what they're there for. Okay, no more.
Yeah, totally. Well. So this is actually a great segue into the thing that I was going to say, which is, what. So Elliot was saying that his approach to like helping people sort of make the leap from rationality to post-rationality is to actually have a response that's something like, wow, like you're so rational, like how do you rationally make sense of like this thing, and like sort of like be extremely supportive of their use of rationality while pointing them at things that their rationality is going to like fail to answer, but like be like so encouraging of the use of rationality for all that, so that the thing can properly find its own limits, sort of Gödel style. And so it was occurring to me that like, okay, at the point when you're at a court of, that's being decided by bribe money, you're like, there should be a better way to do this. I mean, there's a lot more pieces to it than that, but there's a way in which like the thing might reveal its limitations to people faster because it's not being shoved down their throats.
Yeah, and I mean, the Keegan stage 2 people would watch the show in the first place so that they could maximize their own behavior in case that ever happens to them.
Oh.
I feel like a sense of danger about this idea. Like, we're still recording. I'm like, this is going to maybe break something.
Just like speaking the idea.
Like it'll actually happen, and then something really bad will happen. I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we can tag the idea with probably won't compile as written. That'll fix everything. Ignore these 12 errors. They're yeah. This is a great heuristic that I got from the Beeminder folks, although I haven't fully used it, but it's something like if your error system produces an error that doesn't require immediate action, this is an error of your error system. Like if you're like you got some logging reporting, uptime system or whatever, and if it ever sends like cry wolf reports, it's like that's the bug. So it still in fact requires immediate action, which is removing the part where it's crying wolf. So that, like, because otherwise you can't trust the error system in the first place.
That's a really good point. I feel like we should have a single word for this or something.
But yeah, what do they use for it? They're the kinds of people to come up with single words for stuff.
Well, crying wolf is helpful.
Yeah, but it's slightly different.
I use an anchor that's similar of attentional schemas that do not direct your attention to your actual affordances.
Sorry, say that again.
Attentional schemas that do not direct your attention to your actual affordances.
What about them?
So the error system in question would be an example of that, right? So it's trying to direct your attention, but it directs your attention in such a way that is not actually helping you interact with the system in the best way. In fact, it's leading you to interact with it in a worse way in the future, because then now you've been training up ignoring certain error messages.
Right.
Might cause additional problems.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is getting closer to a thorn that removes a thorn, because from the Buddhist perspective, suffering is such an error system.
Yeah. That sounds right.
It's teaching you to pay attention in a way that propagates itself rather than actually helping you.
Which has a really interesting map onto David Deutsch's thing about irrational memes.
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, super cool. You'd love it. Just let me jot enough of the things down that I can. So why do some memes spread and not others? It's like sort of basic question. Some memes spread toxoplasma style because they are optimized for spreading, like intrinsically, sort of at the expense of anything else, because that's how optimizing for one variable works. Other memes spread because they serve their hosts in such a way that the host is like, yo, this meme is pretty great. Like Romeo, have you seen this? Check it out. It's good. And you're like, shit, that is good. I can tell. That solves this problem for me. Great. Amazing. And so David Deutsch has this really fascinating model that says, are you familiar with The Secret of Our Success?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So how do you stabilize the memeplex if people don't understand why the memes work? Well, you need the memes to propagate irrespective of whether people understand why they work.
Sorry, wait, go over that again.
So how do you stabilize a memeplex if people don't understand why the memes work?
Hang on. So I think I want to try to think of my own answer real quick before.
Well, I'm going to go to the bathroom.
Yeah. So I think my initial answer is something like, you make it so that the means by which the memes are transmitted at all carries information that people can, at least in theory, use to reconstruct the original signal. So a practical example would be something like, you don't have the teachers teach the lesson directly. You have them teach the skills such that they can notice what it is they're attempting to do when they are searching for the perfect teacher and getting frustrated with like the fact that the teachers aren't teaching the thing, or like the teachers aren't good enough, or like whatever.
You answered the conscious version of the question, which makes sense. The one I thought I was asking was, how do you do this if you're evolution? And like the kinds of memes you're trying to like stabilize are things like pound the yams so you don't get poisoned.
Bundling. Yeah, like bundling and functional fixedness, I think.
Yeah. So as you indicated, like there's a need for some sort of meta meme, right? Like you need to transfer a bunch of meta memes. And the simplest meta meme to transfer in a certain sense is under no conditions attempt to modify this meme.
Thou
Like-
shalt have no other gods before me.
Right. That's not how we do things here. Why? Because I said so. And
Oh, right. So this, right. Okay. Yes. So the Old Testament was the first pass, probably not the very first pass, but like a pass at like stability at this level. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And then it broke down because like people. And then Jesus came along and like the Jesus meme repairs it. So the thing that you get out of this is your prioritization schema isn't fucked up. You have some sort of ultimate like thing from which prioritization can flow.
mm-hmm.
You have some sort of like stable base. If that gets screwed up and now you have multiple criteria, you come out of all these like horrible log jams on your prioritization schema, which in more fraught civilizational situations will get you killed or your entire tribe killed or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus is repairing the meta meme because you're supposed to install. First it was God, and then like they couldn't believe in that or something. So like now you need like the half man, half God meme to like occupy the highest point of your like prioritization schema,
Mm-hmm.
so that you don't try to like fill it with like very like compete over what to fill it with.
Right. And Deutsch makes the interesting case that this kind of stability actually goes back a lot further than we think, because I mean it's also like, you know, hunter-gatherer tribes, they don't have a like one true whatever, but they do have a one true whole, right? Like they have a choiceless society where this is just how you do things. There's no particular organizing principle, but the organizing principle ends up getting used once people start asking too many questions.
Oh, and so modern religion came about when we started. Oh, this would be very similar to the bicameral mind thesis. Modern religion came about when we started being much more left brain dominant, and then therefore like much more hierarchical in our thinking.
Yeah, and there's a great bit in the Guru papers about religions like just becoming more and more abstract from like, you know, I don't know, there's just like maybe the rain is grumpy to like, no, it's Zeus in particular, to like, no, there's just one God, to the kind of monist thing that's like, well, it's kind of all God or whatever. Anyway, but so coming back to memes though, it's like you can trace this through the spiral dynamics stages, I think. I was trying to really grok like a couple of things converged, but one of them was I was watching ContraPoint's video on envy, which also has a really fascinating take on Christianity, where it's like somehow Christianity memed a bunch of bullies into thinking that bullying was bad in a certain way. Like it had limited effect in some ways. Like there was still plenty of dominance hierarchies, but dominance hierarchies were now bad. Like you shouldn't be on top. That's not nice. As opposed to the kind of in spiral dynamics term, like red meme, where it's just like, no, might makes right. Like you don't even have to say, you can't even say might makes right. It's simply shut up or you die. Like it's, but Christianity kind of came along, and to I guess maybe there's a sort of question of like, to what extent is it the Christ part or the earlier part? And I think there's different different components of each of these. But where was I going? Okay, so then Christianity comes along and says, no, there's something that's truer than power. It's God or something. It's the set
right,
of,
where the former conceptualization would have taken for granted that, well, sure, God, but that means the most powerful one.
right.
Like obvious, like it couldn't. It's a tautology.
Yeah. and so this says, well, the most powerful one has these particular properties, and you're not allowed to even consider the possibility that any of the others are even contenders for this position. And you're supposed to submit to him, actually, not to whoever's the biggest dude in town. But now you've got a concept of truth. So people start getting curious. They're like, well, what is this truth thing, though? How would we know what it is? The Bible doesn't explain all of the details. How do we figure it out? And if you recurse on that enough times, you sort of realize that there's various ways to put this, and it probably was not nearly as clear at the time, but ultimately something occurs where you're like, well, maybe we have to figure it out for ourselves. And so then you get into orange meme, where you're like, but you can't get orange meme from red meme. Is like, this is what prompted me to realize this, is because red meme doesn't have truth except for power. So you need to first have truth some other way. There might be something other than blue meme that gets you there, like other than the sort of monotheistic blue meme that can get you from red to orange. But you can't go straight from red. So then you have like, well, no, like you can figure out truth for yourself. But orange still, I guess, something approximately like takes for granted that there's like one truth, and you can figure all of it out yourself.
Which is a recapitulation. Now we're recapitulating the process we went through with gods, now with the human realm.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so then you get the postmodern green, which says, well, actually, no, there's a lot of truths. Everybody's got one. Good luck. And then you get yellow or teal that says, well, no, there's still one truth, but you've only got part of it. Maybe we can figure it out together. Yeah. And there's still a few pieces I'm missing of why you can't go straight from orange to teal. That piece I still don't quite understand.
What's the color past teal?
The color past teal is turquoise, or teal is also known as yellow.
Okay.
I like yellow better than teal personally.
I'm not familiar with power dynamics, so my guess would be that the next one up is something like wait, no, that doesn't work either, does it?
Hansi Freinocht makes a great case that we can't currently speak coherently about anything beyond yellow because there isn't a large enough scenius of yellow to like notice its own confusion. Like we don't yet have the yellow court where yellow can just properly be yellow and be like, we're fucking buffoons though, wait a minute. Like yellow is still too busy being like, Jesus fucking Christ, everybody is buffoons. Because they don't see the yellow thing, like something like that. I don't think this is strictly true. Like I think I spent a bunch of time hanging out in a kind of yellowish culture, and I noticed a bunch of its limitations, and now I have a bunch of thoughts that almost nobody understands. Right, and so it's like, well, that seems like kind of the thing. Like I'm maybe tasting some things on the other side of the like usual leading edge. Do I understand all of it? Of course not. Like, do I have a scenius to hang out in that actually has that culture? Of course not. But like, I've tasted edges of the limitations of this new thing that is showing up. Anyway, we were going somewhere though with the memeplex thing, which is basically, I think you'd really like his book, The Beginning of Infinity, which kind of goes through all of this. It's kind of like what if the sequences was written by an optimist instead of a pessimist.
I think I skimmed it at one point, and I didn't. I kind of bounced off of his writing style.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, there's other ways to point at it, but it's but I mean, it does actually kind of map onto the thing I was talking about with the thinking that rejects other thinking post.
Mm-hmm.
So the thinking that rejects other thinking post, right, is an error correcting meta meme.
Right. Okay.
But it can't
okay.
listen.
Oh, okay. Okay. So
it can't synthesize.
For things. For things that it's not exact, calling them fragile isn't quite right. It's more like you don't want to break them by trying to force them to scale faster than they actually should scale. You want them to like scale at like the pace that allows their own development so that they like get the best possible versions of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that like you're actually in this kind of weird situation where like part of you knows more about certain things,
Mm-hmm.
but another part of you like kind of knows that you know, but also is like, yeah, but I'm not going to pay attention to that because like there's this thing I'm going to try to do, and I'm going to try to figure out like the best version of it. It's kind of like being in a soundproof studio when you're trying to make music, because like you're not trying to listen to all the other garbage right now. You're trying to like figure out the signal that's very faint and inside of you.
Right.
So it's like, well, why have you carefully constructed this like soundproof box? Like, don't you like truth? shouldn't you want truth to flow into all things all the time? And it's like, no, sometimes you need soundproof boxes because that allows you to do
don't your cells like oxygen? Wouldn't you just like to like remove all the cell membranes so the oxygen could just flow into all of your cells all the time?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, one of the most important words I have come to develop a taste for over the last few years is the word organize.
Wow. I never appreciated the roots of that word.
I wasn't even thinking about the etymology of it until you laughed, and I was like, he's probably oh, haha.
Yeah.
And right, and I'm like, but also like, does organ like what the hell does organ come from? Right. So organ as musical instrument, but also tool for making or doing that which one works. You know, it's not per se, organized is not per se about the body's organs.
Well, but like the root organ, right? It's like to like, or I can't even do it without saying the word organize, to organize the system such that the things that have similar functions are in optimal configuration, like spatially and temporally and whatever, to the other things that would help them do that thing. And then you get these natural clusterings popping up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh yeah, there's specialized function and there's specialized function. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and then also you get the thing that transfers energy and information between those things, right? Like, you know, it's not simply like you know, it's not simply the organs that are like modular, right? Like you can get a kidney transplant, but you can't get a circular, or you can get a heart transplant, but you can't transplant the rest of the circulatory system. It's just too intertwined with everything.
I want to say something like, don't try to eat the sky. Like, stop trying to eat the sky. It's like No. Like as like a mantra to like undo a certain type of error.
Ah,
It's like an abstraction error, right? Like a type error of a sort to try to eat the sky.
yeah. What kind of error does that map onto though? Like,
Like
are you talking about how you're supposed to breathe it instead, or?
you can you can imagine a person coming and looking at the organized human body, and it's got all these specialized organs, and being like, whoa, wait, so did you ever read the short story Things, which was like a fan fiction of the movie The Thing?
No. Who's it by?
It's by the Blind Side guy, Peter Watts.
Oh, interesting.
It's called Things.
The Things.
Yeah. So it's like you have another system come along, and it's like, wait a minute, but like I'm doing this fractal thing, and in the fractal thing, every part reflects the whole. And so like I have a totally different sense of like error correction, right? Because I don't like my error correction is like maximal, because like every part I can reheal from anything, because every part contains, and it's like, well, yes, but like now you have a whole different set of constraints. If every single part has to compress the whole, like that's hugely constraining actually, compared to having a specialized system where different parts don't have to keep track of what the other parts are doing.
Yeah.
Or try to like duplicate their function just in case for redundancy.
Yeah. You get to have like nice clean APIs.
Yeah. So yeah, if humans are also like the organs of the tribe, then it also goes there, because like if each person in the tribe is trying to like recompress the whole structure of the tribe personally, that's a lot of wasted motion. Probably only the village elders should be doing that or something.
Right. And one of the things that we don't have very much anymore, like people talk about, Dunbar's number and various other limitations and blah, 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 blah. But one of the things we don't have really anymore, in some sense, we haven't ever had this thing that we now need, but like we've had, things that map onto it, is people whose full-time job is organizing a community. I don't know if organize is even actually quite the right word there, but it's like shoring up the order of the community, or untangling tangles in the order of the community.
Yeah, the elder literally just spends all day just like talking to various people.
Right. Yeah, that's
like some of them are people who have problems who go to the elders, but also sometimes the elders like wander around and just talk to people and have a much better map of like what's actually happening than any other individual.
Yeah, exactly. And they have the time to do that.
Yeah.
And so, there's a sense in which probably aspects of that are actually necessary to properly Dunbar. Something
right. Dunbar's is not undifferentiated massive humanity.
Yeah.
It's like a system that can organize.
Right. Exactly. There are reasons why people are not bigger than they are.
Yeah.
And there's reasons why we don't live longer than we do. Like there's a bunch of really interesting stuff in the Scale book about that, like about how mammals of all sizes have almost the exact same number of heartbeats. Like, if you're a mouse, your heart beats like, hundreds of times per minute and you die in a few years. If you're an elephant or a blue whale, it beats like way less often. And like the rate that it beats is like very quite precisely correspondent to mass, because you need a certain amount of blood to service all that mass. You need a certain size of aorta coming out of the heart in order to be able to branch the perfect number of times to get the right impedance matching to service all of those parts. You need a certain strength of heart to make those pumps. And it just all like, if you know the equations, if you know the mass of a mammal, then you know roughly how long it's going to live, if it dies from natural causes, and roughly like, how fast its heart beats, and a bunch of other questions. This is a really cool point that he makes in the book, which is basically like, yes, evolution proceeds according to survival of the fittest and all of that selection pressure and stuff, but it is also constrained by like a bunch of network theory and geometry. Like it's sort of obvious, like the simple geometry that like these sorts of things are constrained by, but like even then people are like, but what if there was King Kong or Godzilla? And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. Like that makes as much sense as a world in which everything's the same, but you can't light matches. Like it just doesn't.
So there's probably things that sound like type errors, but actually aren't, at least if you actually repaired them. Like the cardiovascular health of a tribe is like a sensible thing to think about. Probably the exact concept of like a healthy cardiovascular system doesn't map, but there's some sense of like large scale organ interactions.
Yep.
That like can be healthy or unhealthy. And like, we actually haven't gathered any of that data.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of really core questions that have been coming up for me as I've been reading this book. It's like both really core questions about how should a company function, and also really core questions about how should a city function. And it's like, I had a tweet a week or so ago that was something like, I just realized that there's been an evolution over the last 50 years from the terminal unit, which is a technical term that I'll define in a moment, the terminal unit of wages being individuals as opposed to families. Now, of course, wages are a pretty new invention in a lot of ways, so it's not like this is upheaving some tradition in a direct way. Although there is a sense in which this does represent a tradition being upheaved. It's just the wage thing was itself an upheaval of the previous thing that involved most people just farming, or working, one person businesses or like family-sized business, right? But a family-sized business is a family-sized business. How many family businesses do you know these days, right? Like it's like there's a lot. I mean, they exist, but like among the new emerging businesses is a bunch of like one-person startups where it's like, sure, maybe sometimes the spouse does support mail when the like founder is on a retreat or the whatever, but like Danny's kids sometimes illustrate the Beeminder blog posts, right? Anyway, so right, and so there's this shift of the terminal unit from being a family to being an individual. This is huge. Like that's like a change in what a cell is. In terms of big deal.
So it implies that there was a big deal that is far enough in the past that probably we don't have records of it, which is, well, we have a little bit of units of records of it, but like, so in the Old Testament, the unit of justice was whole families or whole tribes.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Right, and justice has shifted to being an individual matter further back, mostly in the West. This is cool how we're weaving all these things in. Like we're back at individuals and justice, right? Like, but coming at it from a cardiovascular perspective instead.
Yeah, the immune system is a fascist police state.
Right, self-other. This pollen is other, it must be destroyed. There were people pointing at how certain olfactory allergies can possibly be reduced by eating the allergen. I haven't looked into this, but people have been gesturing at it, and I could totally see that being a reasonable model. It's sort of like the opposite of a vaccine. It's like, hey, this is actually just food. Don't worry if we breathe in a little bit of it.
So the shift from individual to family and back, like either direction, does involve a shift in what you ignore. So like if you're treating with the individual, so there's a book series, a science fiction book series called the Hominids trilogy.
I read the first one. Yes.
Yeah. So there's
No,
like
I know the analogy you're about to make, but go ahead and make it since we are recording and may post this.
Yeah. So they will sterilize not only the criminal involved, but the family members of the criminal on the basis
for certain violent crimes.
Yeah, for extreme cases, so that they can actually extinct the whole gene line that was related to carrying out that crime.
Yeah.
So justice in the past would have been similar, and going with the individual does ignore that information channel, because we regard it as like too harsh or something. Like, I'm sure there's lots of different ways you could cut that, but so taking money from the family unit and changing it to the individual involves ignoring something. In the case of the criminal justice, it involves ignoring the shared propensity that genetics
both genetically and mimetically.
Yeah. So with wages, one of the things it's doing is declaring that the appropriate level of abstraction for making financial decisions is the individual.
Yes. Yep.
Which definitely undermines marriage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or at least some aspects of marriage.
Yeah.
Feel free to also jam, like I'm just
yeah. No, it's good. There's an article that I remember reading that I have not been able to find again in the about 4 seconds I've spent looking for it since I remembered that I wanted to have it referenceable. I'm sure I'll pull it up eventually because I keep thinking of it now, because it represents to me what seems like one of the most important critiques of UBI, which is that welfare absolutely undermined marriage and people don't like to talk about it. And it undermined it in just a really gradual, subtle way. But basically, as I understand it, according to this article, I mean, I haven't researched this beyond this, but it says something like there was a shift in the 50s, 60s, 70s, somewhere in there, where previously welfare was only available for widows and divorcees. Something like that. And so, like, the idea of going and being a single mom was incoherent. Motherhood is not exactly a full-time job, but should be, in the sense of like how much love a kid needs, but like, and this is not a gendered comment that I'm making here. And so, if you also have to work and someone needs to take care of your kid while you work, like, the thing doesn't scale super well. I mean, it manages to scale now, but basically it's like it gave women a BATNA to marriages that they didn't want. So obviously a great marriage for most people is better than being a single parent. But if your options are shitty marriage or single parent, you might reasonably pick single parent if that's an available option. Which tilts the whole.
So at the level of selection of the child's welfare.
Yeah.
If you were selecting purely on the child's welfare, you would draw a threshold in a different place than the people's individual preferences, because single parenthood is bad enough for child outcomes that you would actually choose to make the threshold fairly high to exiting a shitty marriage from the perspective of the preferences of the parents.
Well, right. Yeah.
So there was a shift there so that's again an example of shifting from the family unit as the unit of selection to the individual, because the individual's preferences are seen as more synchrosat or sovereign.
Right. Yeah.
Which has been an ongoing process.
Yeah.
More atomization is more sovereignty to the individual decisions.
I think this is a really interesting process, because on the one level, there's part of me that's like, oh, fuck, this is probably bad. But on another level, I'm like, no, this is probably good. It's going to have a whole bunch of consequences that we didn't anticipate. And figuring out how to organize new superhuman or new superorganisms out of people, if like families have become slightly incoherent as a concept, which they have and are increasingly becoming, is an engineering challenge. Like it's a systems theory challenge, it's a network theory challenge, like it's being implemented in parallel. There's parallel evolution mimetically and so on going into solving this. So it's like people will come up with solutions, because if they don't, other people will. Like there's a way in which Moloch can do good shit too.
Well, so if you're in one equilibrium with regard to a well-functioning immune system, and then you're transitioning to a new equilibrium, probably in between, you are more susceptible to disease and cancer.
Yes, yeah. And so in that sense, the atomized era is very scary. Like it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, so I think there's some, like, I think a lot of people's intuition is that there's no reason that in theory you couldn't have a cancer that metastasizes that we just don't have good enough defenses to. And it just, you wind up with maximally low trust, everyone defecting against everyone, with no good recovery options.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably mostly too doomy. Things continue to get better. Like our coordination mechanisms are actually still getting better, even though like it is partially a function of our listening organs getting more sensitive to smaller problems that we feel like we're surrounded by problems.
Well, it's partially that, but it's also because the pace of things is increasing, the odds that we get blindsided goes up.
Yeah, and then are not able to react in a very constructive way because the speed.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of a few things. It's like the pace of things is increasing. Aspects of the resilience of the system are decreasing. A windy day in Egypt fucked up the whole globe.
Right. Yeah.
Like, fortunately didn't fuck it up that bad. But like some of that is luck. If the wind had been somehow worse or something, and the thing had gotten more stuck, people were saying like if it had been stuck 2 more days, like people would have starved in certain places, because like a bunch of food would have gone bad. The wealthier countries would have rerouted shipments that were destined to other places to them by bidding way higher. Anyway, so I don't know any of the details of this. But yeah, so it's like the decreasing resilience of the way the system is currently organized, which is partially a function of the atomization, but it's also just like partially a function of organization according to a first order theory of constraints as opposed to second order theory of constraints.
Not familiar.
You know theory of constraints?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I just made up the other terms. And what I mean is something like, if you implement naive theory of constraints, you get just in time blah blah blah. But this generates fragility. And so I don't know what second order theory of constraints is. I don't know what it looks like. I can't say very much about it, in fact. But it somehow outcompetes just in time blah blah blah, and is also way more resilient.
At the very least, it does not firefighting, right? So if firefighting itself has a problem,
yeah,
it doesn't just firefight that problem. It actually does something systematic about firefighting.
Yeah, which comes back to the thinking that rejects other thinking thing.
Right, which is also another good metaphor for the immune system, right? It's the custodius, I don't remember the Latin. Who watches the Watchers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I want to come back to the thing you said about like you don't want things to scale too fast. I think there's something really juicy there that most people don't get. I still don't quite understand the thing you were saying about eating the sky, but let me just try to restate what you were saying about you don't want things to scale too fast. Part of you knows more about the world than another part, but the other part needs to ignore that knows more part in order to get the understanding it needs.
Yeah, so like moving slowly, you can imagine like fingertip feeling, right? Like moving slowly allows a sensitivity to small changes as you move.
Mhm.
And so like you can imagine that a race car going really fast is not paying attention to the way pebbles are strewn on the track.
Mhm.
But like an inchworm is.
Mhm.
So if you don't know the path sensitivity of the process you're engaged in, you might go slower and just see how that goes. And then you might observe over time, like, okay, sometimes I went really violently fast and sometimes I went slow. And it seems like over time, tortoise and hare style, the slow processes are building really firm foundations that then wind up scaling really well. The faster processes, they get like a bunch of wins like right up front, but then they break down.
Right.
It's like the Ferrari that's like, you know, it goes fast and looks nice, but then it's a maintenance nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's something here that again connects back to this word organize, where it's like the there's a part that understands more and a part that understands less. But the part that understands less understands some things that the part that understands more doesn't. Otherwise, it wouldn't need to exist at all.
Right.
And so in order for it to get an understanding that is coherent with the part that understands more, like in order for it to join the more in this newer, better understanding, it needs to go through whatever process will, for it, organize it in that way that understands that thing, which this part does not know or understand, which comes back to the thing you were saying at the very start about like helping somebody out of a hell realm. It's like they have a different, they're starting in a different place than you. Like you can't just print out the map quests that you use to get from point A to point B because they're not starting at point A.
And even if you use a winch and like yank them out by their arms, one, you've just dislocated their arm. And two, you haven't led them through a process that like they just slide back down. Like the moment you turn your back on them, they slide back down.
It doesn't actually produce the reorganization. And this is the thing I'm pointing at about like about information theory being like underappreciated. It's like one of the things I like one of the reasons I like Mark Lippmann's protocol so much is that it seems to me like I've read many other sets of instructions. Now, obviously, lots of sets of instructions are sort of meant to be paired with teaching and like other like higher bandwidth stuff, but like people follow them nonetheless and they expect to get somewhere. And one of the things I like about Mark's system is that it seems to me sort of plausibly containing enough information to be a reasonable approach to the problem. And not just enough information, but the way it's organized and, you know, the way that he like nuanceifies a bunch of stuff with slashes and like, you know, none of those.
The thing I mentioned about the manner in which you transmit, right? So like the fact that it's version controlled itself is transmitting information to the person who's reading it.
Yeah. And so it's like, I used an analogy with somebody recently that was like, imagine that you got a new car and the car manual was like 4 pages long and like wasn't just like some QR code bullshit. Like you'd look at the manual and be like, this is not going to work. Like this manual is insufficient to describe all the ways that this car could go weird. Anyway, so there's something about that, and there's something about like, yeah, it's like that part ultimately is going to do some sort of self-organization process. You can support that, or you can hinder that, and you can support it by attempting to hinder it, and you can hinder it by attempting to support it. Sometimes you can support it by attempting to support it. Yeah, I don't know. That feels really powerful. And like to create an analogy that I think people who don't understand this might reject as relevant because it makes the thing seem so obviously silly, which it is. It's like having, one of your, I don't know, like, what's the best analogy for this? Actually, I have half of the analogy, but I'm missing the flavor. It's like the teacher saying, "Well, Johnny, Billy got it. Why didn't you get it?" Like, because I'm Johnny, not Billy.
Right.
You spent the whole class explaining to Johnny how the thing worked in Mandarin, which I don't even speak.
It's funny because Chinese immigrants would choose very stereotypical names like Johnny and Timmy, not knowing that it's like, like, I don't know, like this, yeah.
Yeah.
So the metaphor that I'm
Sometimes they're
thinking
given
of
lists to choose from. Like, this is actually,
oh yeah.
This situation is actually caused not on an individual level.
Well, it is now, but before it was caused by the lists, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then there's momentum. So the metaphor I'm thinking of is something like, so a VC is like, okay, like the best way that I figured out how to solve this problem is I like fund 10 different people who have different ideas about how to solve it, and I give them all the best advice that I can. And the person's like, wait, but they all pivoted and now they're solving like things that weren't your original problem. And the VC's like, yes, like this is also as intended. And the person goes, I see, because really the intention was to make money. It didn't really matter how. And the VC goes, no, actually, I just say I'm a VC because that's the most useful way to interface with people. What I actually wanted was like 10 companies that are all highly competent at solving like various complicated problems. And like the original problem formulation was only a way to point in the vague general direction that I didn't even have the full picture yet, because the 10 people hadn't done all the work of figuring out all the different parts of the problem yet.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so that's like a whole different kind of portfolio approach or something. I don't know. That's a really subtle metaphor. I don't think most people would get it, but it's good. Like,
PG would get it, but you know.
Well, right. Right. Well, I mean, it would be, it is interesting to think about, like, okay, yeah, suppose you're trying to talk about like, integration, right? And you're like, I don't know, like, suppose you were going to try to make a course or something that's like integration for VCs, right?
You might even be like, all right, I'm going to fund Tranquility Corp, Concentration Corp, Mindfulness Corp. You all go off and figure out what that means. And then come back together. And we'll get some real shit done.
Yeah. Yeah, people really make this fundamental error, which is just so simple. It's like, this actually, this relates to something else too, which is like, you hit upon some truth that's self-evident, right? Like, there's all sorts of self-evident truths, from mathematics to phenomenology or whatever, or attractor based and stuff. So you hit upon some sort of truth that's self-evident, and then you're like, well, everybody should understand this. And then you're like, if people don't understand it, I should just like tell them because it's true, and then they'll get it. And this is actually the opposite of the thing that you need, the thing to do. The actual thing is like, no, this is so self-evident, in fact, that I don't need to tell the other person. If I can sort of ask the question the right way, they'll see it. And I actually trust that, because I actually really, really trust that it's self-evident. I'm not just like grasping to it, even though it's self-evident. And, you know, to name a really simple example of that, like, you know, I was out walking with somebody and we got talking about the square footage of a room, and we multiplied some numbers together and came up with different numbers. And I was like, it's about 100. And she's like, no, it's about 1,000. And I was like, no, it's about 100. You know, just like some sort of order of magnitude fail, right?
Right.
And she's like, no. And I was like, I'll wait. Like, and it was not like a snarky I'll wait. It was just like, I double checked, and I'm happy to let you do the math again yourself until you converge with me. Like, I'm in no rush. You know, we're not making some flash decision here. We're just talking about a hypothetical whatever. And so I'm in no rush. So just, you know, take your time, figure it out. Like, and like bringing that attitude towards like realization of deep metaphysical truths feels like a thing that that feels missing from a lot of how people approach things, and feels like it's missing this, like, don't force the thing to go too fast, don't yank the arm out of the socket.
Well, via selection effects, you are exposed to the versions of teachings that have scaled the best so far, the best.
Mm-hmm.
That does not mean that they have scaled side effect free.
Right.
So the thing that you're talking about exists in one-on-one relationships between teachers and students.
Mm-hmm.
It's just,
Right.
it doesn't, no one's figured out how to get that to work very well outside of that.
You think we can do it?
I believe it might be possible on the scale of short retreats, because there's enough working examples of short retreats that are like sort of working, but also obviously doing some things wrong that seem like they're repairable, such that like you should be able to get like much better short retreats.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is also worth noting that the things that have scaled, like, partially that's because they are able to scale an effect, but like, yes, they also have side effects. But there's also a sense in which, like, you know, to some extent they've scaled because they're good at scaling, like, not because they're good at the underlying thing.
Although they're usually, so yeah, it's hopefully you've at least maintained the taste of the chocolate, right? So like there's some flavor of the original thing.
Right.
It's like some goodness that is directly detectable, and that's why people are.
Yeah.
You do in fact see in the real world that there are pernicious mutations where instead what scales is excuses for why you're not tasting the chocolate.
I mean, I feel like a lot of modern Christianity is that, like, it's
Yes.
not alive anymore, right? Like,
I mean, that happened. That didn't even just happen in modern times, right? Like, no, the gnosis has been in the West has been a thing for The East maintained it.
Yeah. Yeah. It does also seem to me that we're getting more of this stuff into the water supply in a real way. That's like, I mean, I'm sure it'll have its own like spandrels and confusions and stuff, but it's like, it's not like people are getting it, basically. Like, it's like Nick Camerata tweets about happiness too cheap to meter, right? And people read his thing and they go, oh shit, wait, what? Wait, what? Like, you know, and they, you know, they just like, they do their own little experiments and then they tweet about it and they're like, hey, I tried doing this thing that Nick said and like, now I like feel way better. This is kind of cool. Have you guys tried this? Right? And I tweet about like, integrating parts as they want to be integrated, and people go, oh shit, wait, you mean like you could do it in a non authoritarian, you could like do integration in a non-authoritarian way? Wow, what a concept, right? Like, not that people were quite framing it that way, but like there's this like recognition of like, oh wait, you can do that? Oh, right. And this is like mimetic evolution at its finest, right? And like the best articulations are, spreading around, and they are getting error checked because the scene, I'm particularly thinking on Twitter, like is trying stuff and is reporting what's working. And some people have deep detailed meditation practices, but lots of them don't even, like similarly to me, like I'm not doing a bunch of sitting. I have some, attending to my ongoing experience that has some quality of like some sort of awareness practice. And then some people, don't even have that, but they're just like trying different integration practices. And they're like seeing what works and like noticing, hey, this thing like got rid of that weird tension that's been in my hip for years. Like, and like now I don't yell at my partner. Like,
I do think the trauma discourse has been doing a better job of spreading aspects of spirituality than a bunch of the spirituality discourse.
Why do you think that is?
Often a bit more concrete and less metaphysical, right? Like, hey, you are suffering.
Right, like it doesn't make the mistranslating the Buddha error.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and more somatic and stuff. So just more grounded. And then like, there's a thing of like, yeah, providing like just the like examples, like just doing healthy things in front of other people is like underrated. So like, I also like imagine a healthy society is like, they record all of the business meetings. And then there's like a special people of privilege who, remember, in the privilege hierarchy, they're actually highly trustworthy. They're allowed to review all of it, and they don't, it's all confidential and everything. But they select a few examples that they think are particularly healthy. Yeah. And then they get permission. They like pay off, oh, you had business secrets, but we censored that, and then we paid you some extra or something. And then we show people, like, hey, here's good business meetings. People are like, oh yeah, huh?
Wow, it can be like that.
Yeah, and then same thing with therapy, right? Like they actually record the therapy sessions, and they're like, "Hey, look at this therapy conversation." They weren't like, and people are like, "Oh, you can just talk to people that way." And it's just like just like on like you turn to channel 9, like KQED, and it's just like, oh yeah, like if you want like healthy like interactions of the sort, just go to channel 9. You can just watch it anytime. If you're like a kid from like an abused home, like you don't have any other outlet, you can still just watch channel 9 like sometimes. Like, and it's like, oh yeah, there's like some healthy adults doing something.
Oh my fucking god! Yeah, that's so. I have this like, what's the MVP of this kind of question? In some ways, we already have the MVP. It just is people sharing their experiences in various forms, right? Like,
I think like YouTube. So YouTube videos of people doing the various integration techniques already serves this purpose for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing the integration explosion, is just there's a huge difference of just like, here's a YouTube video of someone doing core transformation, and you're like, oh yeah. Or watching Marshall Rosenberg talk about NVC, right? Like read the book and like weird stuff and like try the exercises, or just watch Marshall Rosenberg talk for 5 minutes with someone. Because like vibes transmit more information.
Yeah. Well, I probably want to wrap up pretty shortly, but I'm interested in sort of returning back, one last time to the Thinking That Rejects Other Thinking post that I made that sort of prompted you to reach out to me, and just sort of like, are there any other, I don't know, things that you or I want to say in that lens?
So there's like a double entendre in the word active ignorance, where we could say the goal is actually to make it more like active for real.
Oh, like consciously active.
Yeah, like we're going, okay, we're going to recognize that this is a thing that happens.
Yeah.
And then we're going to say like, okay, I that doesn't mean I need to destroy it in order to fix everything, right? Which is the same old bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
But instead observe skillfully and like what is wholesome and unwholesome about this, and can I help this process along? And can I, in the same way that like we sort of shield children from things, right? It's like
Right.
at a personal and then interpersonal level, how can I make space? It's like the thing where you didn't just like the person was wrong about their estimate and you didn't just jump on them.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, I'm going to let you sit with your ignorance for a few moments because this is actually a great time for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. Fuck yeah. Right. And I really did make that point in a certain way, like differently than you made it here in the don't want to scale too fast thing. But I did say that in the post, which is basically like if somebody is doing this rejecting of stuff, it's because there is some sort of truth that they are trying to hold on to that they don't trust that they can hold on to unless they reject some other truth. And they're doing their goddamn best to like keep a hold of stuff.
Yeah, so a good encapsulation is something like, if they already knew how to hold those truths at the same time, they'd already be there. They're not, so don't try to force them to hold them both at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Right. It's like you can't force someone to do something they don't know how to do.
Yeah, you can just cause them to freak out and freeze or something.
Yeah. Right. And so this then also gets back at the meta loopiness of how, like, in some ways the place to start is with yourself, because like in order to have the thought, if they already knew how to hold those truths at the same time, they'd already be there. You need to be acknowledging that they know something, like that they're sitting with some truth that you're, I guess, no, technically they could be sitting with a truth that you are also aware of, and they're just rejecting some additional thing that you're trying to point out.
Yeah, but I mean, usually the assumption is that like the path dependency that they have is not, like, humans are high dimensional enough.
Yeah.
That like even if they're trying to get to the same peak, the path dependence is not like
Not the
irrelevant.
same, so yeah, it doesn't map on. This was something I struggled with a bit in writing the post. Like I removed a paragraph that was saying something like, I put it back in a less extreme form, but the original version was something like, if you really understood like everything they understood and more, then you would simply just be able to explain it all to them. And like that's not actually true for a few reasons. One of which is the path dependent thing. That means that like the notion of understanding everything that they do and more is actually just never true. Like you just actually have not lived their entire life, and you certainly haven't lived it without living yours, which has its own whole like flavor to it. So it's just actually not true in that sense. But and maybe that's an important insight to have, honestly, right? It's like maybe to have a conditional that's like, I mean, people would argue against it, right? But it's still an interesting point to make. It's like it is actually true that if you understood everything they did and more, you'd be able to explain it perfectly, and that never happens. Is like the biting the bullet of the response that says, well, but I can't ever seem to do these. Yes, you can't, because you don't. But there is still, in another sense, a worthwhile thing to say about like times when you, in some sense, understand all the pieces that they understand and more. But you have your understanding of them. You still don't have theirs.
Yeah, so I would say, so I would encapsulate that as something like pointing a degree of freedom out to someone is not the same as like grabbing their arm and like forcing it onto the new degree of freedom.
Yeah. Huh. Can you concretize that one down? Or not, I mean, the arm thing is very concrete, but like how does that show up in a scene?
So like a person can be running around a trauma loop over and over again.
Mhm.
And the therapist can be like, well, I can just directly point out that this is like a loop and that like this particular part of the loop doesn't actually make any logical sense.
Mhm.
And maybe they've tried that or like whatever, like maybe this time doesn't work. Or like the therapist can like hold space for them running through that loop while gently inclining in a direction
Mhm.
of like noticing a particular aspect of the loop
Mhm.
and like not be super committed to like they need to notice it in a certain length of time or in a certain way. It's just like you're
Right.
just like it's a gentle like directionality.
Mhm.
I can't think of a good metaphor.
This feels to me a little bit like, and maybe it's sort of the opposite. Like I'm actually not sure exactly which one of these things you're calling pointing versus grabbing their arm. Like you could, there's gently grabbing their arm and there's forcefully and violently grabbing their arm and all of that.
So there's like pointing out, and then there's if they're open to it, being like I can try gently moving your arm if that would be
Right.
helpful. If you tell me that like slowly enough, going back to the slowness thing, that you can tell me if like, oh no, actually I'm not as flexible as you because I haven't stretched in that direction before.
Right.
So like that's yeah. So and
Nice.
then forcing, yeah.
Nice, that's great. Yeah, it reminds me in some weird way, and again, the metaphor might not fully map, but there's something neat here. So in the Dream Mashups post, I have this really cool concept, which currently that post is like the thing I link to when I want to point out this concept, but I might make it its own whole post. Maybe, which is becoming an invalid target for somebody else's projection. People do this really funny thing where they get really, they adopt this whole air of powerlessness when somebody's projecting something on them. But it's like they're projecting a specific thing onto you. They're not projecting like every other experience they've ever had in their life onto you. They're projecting this thing onto you. So why are you somehow compatible with that projection? Like, you may not know. I think it's really important to acknowledge you might not know enough about what's generating their projection to have any good guesses about how to respond in a way that like doesn't confirm the projection. But a lot of what people tend to do when somebody's projecting on them is they say, that's not me. What are you doing? Wake up. And they might say that in that sort of, spiritual-ish language if they're in a spiritualist frame. But if they're just like, if they're a therapist, they'll say something like, look, I'm not your mom, or, like maybe a bad therapist or something. If they're a partner, they'll just be like, what the fuck? I'm not blah, 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 blah. This is different from doing something that would allow them to realize that you're not blah, 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 blah. And it might in fact be that being like, what the fuck? I'm not blah, 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 is exactly the sort of thing that blah, 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 blah would do.
And this is part of where crazy wisdom comes from, right? So a person external to the scene watching that sees the one person treat the spouse like their parent, and the parent just does some random action, and the person's like, oh shit, of course, it's my spouse. And the person from the external scene is like, what? How did that random action map to the person realizing? It's like, well, no, because that person knew how that person relates to their mom well enough that they knew to do an action that is strange in a way that their parent would not have done.
Yeah. Right, and that requires being able to respect the frame that they do have while having your own. Yeah. To not forget that you're their spouse, not their mom.
Right, and that's how two-sided trauma loops get built, right? So that both people are hypnotized at the same time.
Yeah. It seems to me that a thorough I think we've talked about this before when you were talking about how fast the Buddha and his followers were waking people up. It seems to me that a thorough awakeness would be extremely viral. Something like that.
Yeah, it's I don't know, because like
it might still be slow because of the whole thing we were talking about shit needing to actually get organized, right?
It's at least partially true. Like people like Adyashanti fill up like venues.
Mhm.
And it's like, it's not clear that it's like, oh, his discourse is so much better than other spiritual teachers' discourse. He's not saying anything in particular, like on the object level, that's all that different. I think it's something about his presence, right?
Mhm.
Some people comment on it sometimes. They're like, it's like there's no one there, or other things that like are less
different
but
maps. Yeah.
But same thing, like Shinzen made a recent breakthrough, and there's a palpable difference in his energy, right? Since like I think it was like a year and a half ago or something.
Oh, interesting.
And people have noticed. And Kenneth Folk, there's a palpable thing in his energy, such that people are drawn to it. They can tell that it's something different or something that's there.
That seems like a neat thing to aim for. Like the thing I said a minute ago about like very viral but also slow. It's like, because again, if we're talking about something that's thorough and we're talking about something that's information theoretically well organized, then it's like, you just imagine that. So imagine like suppose that it's the case that there exists some level of awakenedness or something. This is all extremely crude. If we post this to YouTube and you're listening to this, like take all of this with like a whole shaker of salt. But like we posit some level of awakeness that we call 1,000, and most people are hanging out between like like 2 or maybe some negative numbers or whatever and like 100 or something. And and we posit that something like, the whole like you are the average of the 5 people you spend time hanging out with. Well, obviously that's a zero-sum game unless people are actually doing some good sense, actually doing some sense making. And I think different groups more or less are doing sense making, right? Like, the teacher is not getting dragged down to the level of the students, hopefully, right? If they are, something weird's going on, in terms of their discernment. So imagine something like, and this is what I'm kind of getting at with like the virality but slowness. Imagine something like if you spend an hour with that person, at some scale of width, I don't know, and this all just like maps out over distributions and stuff. If you spend an hour with that person, you go up 1 notch on this scale. But you only get 1 notch a day. It's something like, well, after 3 years of hanging out with this person, you'd also be at 1,000. Something like that. And if you imagine that, of course, the effect doesn't just suddenly turn on at 1,000, right? But like if you're at 500, then people get half a notch up per day. Then the whole thing does this like thing, but it is still actually in some other senses really slow. Like it's not like a weekend breakthrough, oh my God, although those might happen, and various non-monotonic like ups and downs over the course of the journey.
So I think it is, it's sensitive enough to be, as you like you say. Mm-hmm. It's also the reproduction number is like low enough that it's very fragile and sensitive. So like you do see this repeated, like you look through the history, mm-hmm. and you see these like seemingly somewhat exponential explosions, mm-hmm. but then they break for various reasons. And then like for a while it'll be like sort of piddling along and lineages will die out, and like maybe you get like a new resurgence here and there. And it's just like mm-hmm.
It seems to me like it should work slightly differently with now that we're in the, at least somewhat in the era of people having a kind of baseline meme of like, you don't just have to propagate the memes that you got, you can like make them better or something. Like most of the previous exponentials would have been happening in what David Deutsch is calling like the anti-rational static society memeplex, where the basic way that memes reproduce is just by reproducing, not by like being good. And we are very far from having transitioned fully into the other thing. Like that would be an awakened society, basically, which is something that he doesn't seem to quite understand. Like he gets the thing cognitively and is like, we're there. Like we now have a dynamic society where people come up with their own memes that are better and they don't just like spread the whatevers. On some intellectual level, he also obviously knows that people are still being beaten into submission for changing the memes too much. But like the way that he talks about like the change, it's as if it happened in the Enlightenment and like the rest is just like accounting. Whereas from my perspective, it's very much still happening. But it does seem that it's like you can now talk about with unenlightened people the idea that ideas might work in a non-dualistic way. Something like that. You know, which is what this thinking that rejects other thinking blog post is about. I can just now post that to my not particularly spiritual blog as just like, hey, have you noticed what your mind is doing with memes? Have you noticed what it's doing with what it's doing with memes? Does that work? I think it doesn't. Well, not when it works like this, like, you know, and just it's yeah. So that seems to me like, you know, if there's going to be something that lets the thing like have a way higher R value this time, it might be something like that.
It's tricky. So once people make that transition, they are far less likely to do things that scale. So they do not put out discourses on the well-defined subject matter that is like totally legible to like normal people, and therefore like it's so the stuff from before Shinzen's transition, for instance, YouTube videos of like the fastest way to enlightenment, this system will blah 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 blah. That stuff is popular. His new stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which is like, it's still there's still cause for hope, because being at that level is still good. Like it's still pulling people up.
Right. And it's maybe helping more people get even further up than they would have been able to get with his earlier stuff or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Is that because of the thing you were saying about like, once you start, I forget how you phrased it. When your compression libraries get really good, you start running into the same problems as the Taoists, but you can't explain it to anyone.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that the modern era can do that was not possible before is something more like version control, or like something like recording the entire path dependency of people's path. And then people can do as monkey do and not as monkey say. And just like copy what the teacher actually did, instead of paying so much attention to like the teacher's construal of what they did.
Mm-hmm. Right, and this included in this is just being able to like watch the teacher's vibe on YouTube at different points in their process or whatever. I'm super curious how many people are going to get enlightened downstream of that that bodybuilder guy.
Frank Yang.
Yeah, Frank Yang. Like,
wait, is Frank Yang there's a different guy called Yang who's the
UBI
like
guy? That's Andrew Yang.
Andrew Yang, that's it. Yeah.
I went through the same mental process like a minute ago, because I was like Frank Yang was bubbling up in my mind. It's like, is that his name? Yeah, he has the same last name as Andrew Yang, but he's Frank. Yeah.
He's more Frank.
Right. Yep. Right. So yeah, so YouTube videos are part of that. You know, version control is another part of that.
Channel 9 is another part of that.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Right, and Twitter is some other part of that.
Although it has a weird, it is a time thing. It's a little bit better about time than Facebook, but it does have a weird time thing.
In terms of being too now-y?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's where like a bunch of the proposals that I want to make to Twitter include like improvements to search and improvements to quote tweeting that will like decrease the nowness and like deepen the depth of the thing. It's like, and one of the main ones is like currently you can't quote tweet multiple tweets at once.
Ooh, yeah.
If you could
as
do
soon as you
that,
say it, right? Like it's just like, oh, right.
if you do the fact that you can't do that makes Twitter intrinsically divergent. There is no single utterance that can unify two utterances. Like you can a little bit do it in a kind of like fold in way by having like a thread and then midway through you quote tweet something else in, and it kind of unifies that tweet with this whole train of thought. But it's a folding in, it's not a proper union, right? Like if each tweet is an utterance, right, which is a pretty good way to think about it, then there is no way to say as a single proper well-formed utterance, these two ideas are equivalent. These two ideas contradict. This implies that. This states the same thing as that, but better. Like you can't make any of those utterances properly on Twitter right now. And like all of those would lead to hugely better thinking of people on Twitter.
You know what would be a sad world to be in? The one where their data structure makes this actually quite annoying on their end.
Given that, given that quote tweets were sort of tacked on as a concept later anyway, and given that given that quote tweets are stored in their like visual hierarchy of data structure in a similar way to how photo attachments are, which already allow for 4. I mean, it's pretty different, but it's like something like that. I have a bunch of mock-ups of what this could look like, by the way, and like ways to make the composer not too frustrating and stuff like that. Nice. And because I as somebody who builds an app myself, the difference between you should solve this problem versus like, what if the thing did this and looked like that? Like you can just sort of immediately engage with it and be like, yeah, that would be good. That'd be like, N hours of work, but like it's sort of like the picture is complete. I guess in a PCT sense, it's like you've got the reference level there, not just like on like a level of what it would look like and feel like and so on, not just on the level of like you wouldn't have this problem anymore.
Negative versus positive navigation.
Exactly, yeah.
What did you call them? You called them something different, right?
Well, punishment and rewards are one way to do it, but like that has a bunch of other connotations. Towardsness and awayness.
That is more verby.
Towards and away. I mean, they're like prepositions or something even.
I don't know. Feels.
I agree that it's more verby. Yeah. Punishment. I mean, punish is a verb, right? And like reward is also a verb.
Yeah.
But like, yeah. I'm currently in the process of causing dozens of people to get into PCT, which is really fun. I just like decided I was going to do that, and I set my reference level, like how many people should be into PCT, and then I'm like making the thing go up.
So you do have to be careful with bit flips though, because then some people will get into PCP if they don't have ECC corrected RAM and stuff.
Wait, are you referring to a different acronym?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
PCP is the drug.
Oh, we'll get into P. Oh, sorry, I didn't hear the P. I heard I just heard a repetition of some people will get into PCT.
Yeah.
And which would have been a coherent thing to say. And it would have meant something like, but have you considered the negative side effects of some people getting into PCT, right? Like, or anyway, so that's what I thought you meant initially. Anyway, yeah. But I think that'll be really good because it provides such a foundational underpinning of why punishment is systematically confused and why reward is temporary relief of punishment. And it's like, and if you really properly get those things, then a whole bunch of other stuff just shakes out as obvious now. Yeah. Including a bunch of the Dharma.
Yeah, I think it would be possible to do a post on the punishment and reward at the various Keegan levels.
Oh, interesting.
Probably the same thing in the realms too. But yeah, I'm starting to lose thread. I need to eat before my next call.
Yeah, seems good.
This was good.
This has been awesome. Yeah.
I don't think we've said anything that is not too bad. Like everything that we've said that is potentially bad is buried deep enough in that only people who are
into it will watch. Yeah, I think so too. And it's and even that stuff is just sort of like, I mean, again, it's like it's incomplete pseudocode for a thing that wouldn't work and would be a lot of effort to try to set up. I think mostly. Yeah. The channel 9 thing is super cool, and we should meme that into existence.
You could probably do it with just a website that's like a YouTube thing, but like some sort of curated.
Huh. Yeah.
Like the MVP of it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You don't need a whole TV channel to start with. I mean, obviously, but like, I'm not going to suggest we workshop the name now because we want to sign off, but we could workshop the name a bit in DMs or something.
Bob Ross, all the things.
Oh, this could actually be a thing to do a barn racing on, actually. All right.
Until next time.
Take care. Yes.